Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content here on Sleep Theories, please consider using those hype points on this video. It genuinely helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to, of course. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It really builds this incredible community of curious minds from every corner of the globe. Also, a massive thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this topic. Now, let's get into it. The Hynek Files. The scientist who saw too much. Imagine being the person the government calls when they need someone to make the impossible sound ordinary. Imagine spending 3 decades explaining away what you know, deep down, cannot be explained. Imagine carrying secrets so heavy that even on your deathbed you can only hint at the truth. This is the story of J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who became the Air Force's chief UFO debunker, only to become the phenomenon's most credible believer. A man who spent 22 years inside Project Blue Book, the military's official UFO investigation program. A man who, by the end of his life, was convinced the government had been hiding the real story all along, and 3 months after giving his final interview, he was dead. The tapes from that interview, gone, vanished from a university archive by someone who never signed in. This is where documented truth becomes stranger than fiction. The last interview, April 1986, Evanston, Illinois. The room is small, cluttered with star charts and aging textbooks. Afternoon light filters through half-closed blinds, casting long shadows across the desk where J. Allen Hynek sits, 75 years old, his face lined with decades of secrets. Across from him, a graduate student adjusts a tape recorder. Her name is Rebecca Marks, though she won't become important to this story until much later. This is supposed to be a simple oral history project for Northwestern University, nothing more than an elderly professor reflecting on his career in astronomy. Standard academic documentation. But Hynek keeps glancing at the door. The student notices but doesn't comment. She's young, maybe 23, and she's done her research. She knows Hynek spent more than 2 decades as the scientific consultant to the Air Force's UFO investigation programs. She knows about Project Blue Book. She knows about the swamp gas explanation that made him a punchline in 1966. What she doesn't know yet is that this interview will haunt her for the rest of her life. They talk for 90 minutes. Hynek is measured, careful, professional. He discusses stellar classification, his work at Ohio State, the development of satellite tracking systems, all safe territory. His answers are the kind you'd expect from any distinguished astronomer nearing the end of his career. Thoughtful, precise, unremarkable. Rebecca notices his coffee cup. He's barely touched it. His hands rest on the desk, but his fingers keep tapping in a regular rhythm against the wood. Nervous energy from a man who spent his entire career projecting calm authority. Then, as she's packing up the recorder, reaching for the power button, Hynek speaks again. His voice is different now, quieter, urgent, almost a whisper. History will remember Project Blue Book as an investigation, he says, but it was really a filter. The real cases never reached the public. Rebecca's hand freezes over the recorder. She looks at him. What do you mean, the real cases? Hynek's hands are shaking slightly. He's staring at something beyond her, beyond the room, as if seeing through the walls into some distant memory he's carried for too long. The ones they told me not to classify as unexplained. The ones where the evidence was too clear, too consistent, too troubling. He pauses, and in that silence Rebecca can hear the buildings settle around them. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant sound of traffic on Sheridan Road. There were files I could never see, Hynek continues. Reports removed before I arrived. Witnesses told to recount their statements. Photographs that disappeared before analysis. Who told them to recant? Hynek just shakes his head slowly. People who decided what the public could handle. People who understood that some truths destabilize entire systems of belief. Rebecca asks if she can keep recording. Hynek says no. but he keeps talking anyway for another 20 minutes, off the record. She frantically pulls out a notebook and scribbles, trying to capture every word. He mentions cases by location and date, incidents she's never heard of. A radar tracking event over Montana in 1953 involving multiple installations. Visual confirmations by commercial pilots over the Great Lakes in 1961. Objects tracked across state lines, moving at speeds that made no aerodynamic sense. Physical evidence, burned soil, electromagnetic interference, radiation signatures that disappeared into classified channels before civilian scientists could examine it. "Why didn't you say something publicly?" she asks, her pen moving rapidly across the page. "I tried," Hynek replies, and there's something broken in his voice now. "In my way, carefully. I spoke at universities. I wrote papers with coded language. I built networks with other researchers. But there are people who don't want this conversation to happen. Not because they're evil, necessarily. Because they're terrified of what it means." He leans forward, and Rebecca sees something in his eyes she'll remember for the rest of her life. Not fear, exactly. More like the exhaustion of a man who's carried a weight too heavy for too long. "Do you know what happens when you tell the public that everything they believe about reality might be incomplete? When you suggest that non-human intelligence has been interacting with us, studying us, for decades? The social structures we've built, religion, science, government authority, they all rest on certain assumptions. You pull one thread." He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't have to. Before she leaves, he tells her one more thing. The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. 3 months later, J. Allen Hynek is dead. Heart attack. Nothing suspicious on paper. The obituaries call him a distinguished astronomer and the scientific advisor to Project Blue Book. They mention his later work founding the Center for UFO Studies. They're respectful, brief, forgettable. When Rebecca Marks returns to the university archive 2 weeks later to review the interview tape for her thesis, she's told it's missing. The archive log shows someone checked it out 6 days after Hynek's death. No name, no signature, no ID number, just a checkout date and time, May 3rd, 1986, 2:15 p.m. Rebecca files a complaint. The university apologises, calls it an administrative error. The tape is never found. She asks to see security footage from the archive reading room. She's told the system was malfunctioning that week. She contacts the campus police. They file a report and nothing happens. Years later, after she's completed her PhD and moved into a career in science journalism, Rebecca will occasionally Google J. Allen Hynek's name. She'll read the conspiracy forums, the UFO research sites, the academic papers analysing Project Blue Book's methodology. And she'll wonder if Hynek knew his time was running out. If that interview was his last attempt to leave breadcrumbs for someone willing to follow them. If he suspected someone was listening, watching, waiting for him to say too much. She still has her handwritten notes from those 20 minutes after the recording stopped. She keeps them in a safe deposit box. She's never published them. She's not sure she ever will. But sometimes, late at night, she takes them out and reads them again. And she thinks about what Hynek said. The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. The public history versus the secret history. To understand what Hynek knew and why it terrified him, you have to understand who he was before the Air Force recruited him. Joseph Allen Hynek was born May 1st, 1915 in Chicago, son of Czech immigrants who'd fled Europe seeking opportunity and stability. His father worked in a cigar factory. His mother took in sewing. They were working-class people who valued education above everything else. From childhood, Hynek was obsessed with the stars. He'd spend hours on the roof of their apartment building with a homemade telescope, charting constellations, tracking planets. His parents couldn't afford books, so he haunted the public library, devouring everything he could find about astronomy, physics, mathematics. He was brilliant. Everyone knew it. Teachers, neighbours, family friends. By age 12, he was doing university-level mathematics. By 15, he taught himself calculus. He earned a scholarship to the University of Chicago, then completed his doctorate in astrophysics by age 24. His dissertation on stellar spectroscopy, the analysis of starlight to determine a star's composition and characteristics, was considered groundbreaking work. By 1940, he'd secured a faculty position at Ohio State University. By all accounts, he was living the dream, a kid from a working-class immigrant family who'd become a respected scientist. In the academic world, Hynek was known as meticulous, sceptical, grounded in observable data. He had no patience for speculation or pseudoscience. He believed the universe could be understood through measurement, mathematics, and careful observation. He did not believe in flying saucers. When the UFO phenomenon exploded across America in the late 1940s, after Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting over Mount Rainier in June 1947, after the Roswell incident weeks later, after hundreds of reports began flooding military installations, Hynek thought it was mass hysteria. Post-war anxiety manifesting as delusion. People seeing aircraft and planets and making them into something alien. He said as much in faculty meetings. He wrote dismissive letters to colleagues who took the subject seriously. He considered the whole thing beneath serious scientific inquiry, which is exactly why the Air Force wanted him. 1948. The United States military is hemorrhaging credibility over UFO reports. Pilots, combat veterans with thousands of flight hours, are seeing objects that outperform any known aircraft. Radar operators are tracking things moving at speeds that should tear apart any physical object. The public is fascinated and increasingly convinced the government is hiding something. The Air Force needs someone with impeccable scientific credentials to calm things down. Someone who can look at the data and confidently say, weather balloons, temperature inversions, atmospheric phenomena, misidentified aircraft, optical illusions. Someone who doesn't believe in flying saucers. J. Allen Hynek seemed perfect for the job. He's recruited into Project Sign, the Air Force's first official UFO study, in late 1948. The initial contact comes through official channels, a letter on Air Force letterhead, signed by a general Hynek has never heard of. Would he be interested in consulting on a scientific matter related to aerial phenomena? Compensation provided. Minimal time commitment. Purely advisory role. Hynek is intrigued, and honestly, a little amused. He sees it as an opportunity to apply real science to a question that's become hopelessly muddied by speculation and sensationalism. His job is simple: review sighting reports and provide scientific explanations, and at first, that's exactly what he does. A pilot reports seeing a disc-shaped object. Hynek explains it's likely a lenticular cloud formation, which can appear metallic in certain lighting conditions. Radar picks up an unidentified blip. Temperature inversion, he says. Under certain atmospheric conditions, radar waves can bounce off warm air layers, creating false returns. Multiple witnesses see strange lights. Venus, he explains patiently. At certain times of year, Venus appears exceptionally bright and can seem to move due to atmospheric distortion and the observer's own motion. He explains away lights in the sky as Venus, Jupiter, meteors, balloons, experimental aircraft. Strange radar blips as temperature anomalies, equipment malfunctions, birds flocking in formation. Pilot reports as optical illusions caused by fatigue, reflected starlight, or misidentified conventional aircraft. Publicly, he tells the press, most UFO sightings can be explained by natural phenomena or misidentification. When you apply rigorous scientific analysis, the mystery disappears. The Air Force loves him. The press quotes him. Skeptics cite him. He becomes known as the scientific voice of reason in a field dominated by speculation. Internally, though, something begins to shift, because some cases don't fit the script. There are reports where Venus can't be the answer because Venus wasn't visible in that part of the sky at that time, where temperature inversions can't explain radar returns, because the atmospheric conditions were documented and stable, where pilot testimony is too detailed, too specific, too consistent with physical evidence on the ground. Hynek starts keeping two sets of notes. The official reports he submits to the Air Force, carefully worded to provide conventional explanations, and his personal observations filed away in notebooks he keeps locked in his office. In those personal notes a pattern begins to emerge. A growing sense that he's not investigating a phenomenon, he's managing one. Project Grudge and the first red flags. By 1951, Project Sign has been quietly restructured into Project Grudge. The name change isn't subtle, and that's the point. Grudge was chosen deliberately. It reflected the Air Force's official stance that UFO reports were a nuisance, a distraction from real national security concerns like the Soviet threat and the Korean War. The mission was no longer investigation, it was dismissal. Hynek noticed the change immediately. The tone of the briefing shifted. The types of cases sent to him changed. Suddenly the most intriguing reports, the ones with multiple witnesses, radar confirmation, physical evidence, weren't reaching his desk anymore. Instead, he received obvious misidentifications, hoaxes, reports that were easy to debunk, cases designed to make the entire phenomenon look foolish. When he asked about the more credible cases he'd heard about through military channels, he was told they were being handled by other departments, national security concerns, need-to-know basis. He started keeping more detailed personal notes, fragments that would later surface in his private papers, giving researchers a glimpse into his growing disillusionment. One entry, dated September 1951, received truncated report on Utah sighting. Multiple witnesses, including commercial pilot and ground observers. The witness claimed the object descended vertically at high speed, hovered approximately 200 feet above desert floor for estimated 45 seconds, then accelerated horizontally, disappearing from view in under 3 seconds. Radar confirmation mentioned in initial summary but absent from final report sent to me. When I requested full radar logs, told they were unavailable due to equipment malfunction. 3 different radar stations experienced simultaneous equipment malfunction. The statistical probability approaches 0. Hynek was starting to see a pattern. The most compelling evidence was being filtered out before it could reach him. He began making inquiries through unofficial channels, conversations with radar technicians at air traffic control centres, informal discussions with pilots he knew from his work at Ohio State. What he heard troubled him deeply. The cases were real, the radar data existed, the photographs were clear. But somewhere between the initial report and official investigation, crucial details were disappearing. And then something stranger happened, something that convinced Hynek he was under surveillance. He wrote a letter to a colleague at another university, an astronomer named Thomas Gillespie, who he'd known since graduate school. The letter was carefully worded, but it asked a pointed question. Have you noticed institutional resistance to objective UFO study? I'm finding it increasingly difficult to access primary source data. Hynek mailed the letter from the campus post office on a Tuesday morning. He remembered because he had a faculty meeting immediately afterward. The letter never arrived. 2 weeks later, Hynek called Gillespie to follow up. Gillespie said he'd received no letter. Hynek contacted the postal service. They had no record of it being lost or returned. It had been properly stamped, properly addressed. It simply vanished somewhere between the Columbus post office and Berkeley, California. One lost letter might be coincidence. But Hynek had mailed other correspondence that same day. Personal letters to family, a note to a colleague about an upcoming conference. All of those arrived without issue. Just the letter about UFOs disappeared. Hynek wrote in his journal that night, "The phenomenon is not being studied, it is being buried, and I suspect anyone asking too many questions is being watched." That's when he began to suspect he wasn't working for an investigation. He was working for a containment operation, and his role wasn't to find the truth, it was to provide plausible deniability. He considered resigning, but he realised that leaving would mean losing any access he had, however limited. At least inside the program he could see some of the data. He could document the inconsistencies. He could perhaps slowly build a case for the phenomenon's legitimacy. So he stayed. But he stopped trusting his employers, and he started preparing for the possibility that someday someone would need to know what he'd witnessed. Project Blue Book and 22 years of controlled access. 1952. Project Grudge becomes Project Blue Book, a name chosen to sound official, scientific, comprehensive. The rebranding was deliberate. The Air Force needed to convince the public and Congress that they were taking the UFO question seriously. Project Blue Book was given more resources, better staffing, improved investigative protocols. On paper, it looked like a legitimate scientific endeavour. To the public, Blue Book represented the government's good faith effort to understand the UFO phenomenon. It had scientists, standardised reporting forms, investigative teams dispatched to interview witnesses. It published annual reports. It looked legitimate. J. Allen Hynek was appointed chief scientific consultant. His name lent credibility. His presence suggested serious scientific inquiry. For the next 22 years, from 1952 to 1969, he would review thousands of cases. Officially, Blue Book investigated 12,618 UFO reports during its operational lifetime. Hynek later claimed that number was misleading on multiple levels. Many explainable cases, he said, were exaggerated to make the Air Force look thorough. Simple misidentifications, aircraft lights, bright planets, obvious hoaxes, were written up as detailed investigations to pad the statistics. The message: look how many cases we solve. Meanwhile, many genuinely unexplainable cases were either downgraded, reclassified, or removed from the archive entirely before final publication. The process worked like this. A UFO report would come in through military or civilian channels. An initial investigation would be conducted. Witness interviews, site visits, photographic analysis, radar data collection. If the case was easily explainable, it went straight to Blue Book's official files. If the case was complex or unexplainable, it went somewhere else first. Somewhere Hynek didn't have access to. When, or if, he eventually saw it, crucial details had been removed or altered. Witness statements mentioning structured craft were summarised as unusual light in sky. Radar data confirming visual sightings was classified as equipment anomaly. Photographs showing clear objects were deemed inconclusive or possible lens flare. Multiple independent witnesses were reduced to single. Observer report. Hynek was given edited versions of reality. He began to realise he was seeing a curated version of the phenomenon, the parts someone had decided was safe for him to analyse and publicly explain. He started keeping more extensive personal records. After official investigations, he would quietly contact witnesses directly, conducting informal follow-up interviews. What they told him often contradicted the official reports he'd received. He also began networking with other researchers who were noticing the same patterns. Scientists and military personnel who suspected the official investigation was a facade. The cases that broke him. 2 events changed Hynek from skeptic to believer. Both were real, both remain unexplained, and both revealed just how much the Air Force was willing to manipulate the truth. The Lubbock Lights, August 25, 1951, Lubbock, Texas. 4 college professors are sitting in a backyard enjoying the warm evening air and discussing micrometeorites. These aren't random civilians. They're scientists from Texas Tech. A chemist, a physicist, a petroleum engineer, and a geologist. Professional observers trained to document phenomena accurately. At 9:20 p.m, one of them happens to glance up. What the hell is that? A formation of the lights is moving across the sky. Not random lights. A perfect V-shaped pattern, like birds flying in formation, but faster than any bird could fly. The lights are bright, bluish-white, distinct against the night sky. The formation covers the entire visible sky in about 3 seconds. That's an angular velocity that suggests incredible speed, potentially thousands of miles per hour depending on altitude. The professors barely have time to process what they've seen before it's gone. They sit in stunned silence for a moment, then immediately begin comparing observations. What colour were the lights? How many? What was the exact pattern? How fast were they moving? Their accounts match perfectly. 20 to 30 lights, bluish-white, V-shaped formation, silent, moving from north to south. Then, 18 minutes later, it happens again. Same formation, same speed, same trajectory. Over the next 2 weeks, the lights appear multiple times. Dozens of Lubbock residents see them. The local newspaper runs stories. The sightings make national news. On August 30th, a Texas Tech freshman named Carl Hart Jr. photographs them. He sets up his camera in his backyard, and when the lights appear, he captures 5 clear photographs. The images show the V formation exactly as witnesses described, multiple lights in perfect geometric arrangement. The photographs are remarkably clear. Hart brings them to the newspaper, which publishes them on the front page. The images go national. Life magazine runs them. They become some of the most famous UFO photographs of the era. The Air Force dispatches investigators. Hynek reviews the case file, and he cannot explain it. He interviews the professors personally. These are credible witnesses, trained observers with nothing to gain from fabricating a story. Their descriptions are consistent, detailed, and sober. He examines Hart's photographs. They're not hoaxes. Analysis shows no evidence of double exposure or manipulation. The lights are real. Physical objects photographed over multiple frames. He considers conventional explanations. Aircraft? No aircraft flies in that type of formation or at that speed. Meteors? Meteors don't move in perfect geometric patterns or repeat the same trajectory multiple times over 2 weeks. Reflections? Reflections don't appear to multiple witnesses in different locations and don't move consistently across the sky. Hynek writes in his official analysis, "The lights exhibited intelligent control. They moved in coordinated formations at speeds inconsistent with known aircraft. The photographic evidence is compelling. Multiple credible witnesses with consistent testimony. I cannot provide a conventional explanation that adequately accounts for all observed phenomena." That report goes up the chain of command. When the official Blue Book conclusion is published, the Lubbock lights are attributed to birds reflecting streetlights. Birds? Hynek is furious. He knows this explanation is absurd. Birds don't fly in perfect V formations at supersonic speeds. Birds don't glow with bluish-white luminescence. Birds don't maintain geometric precision while covering the entire visible sky in 3 seconds. But the case is closed. The Air Force has its explanation, and the press runs with it. The Lubbock lights become a joke. Scientists fooled by birds. Hynek tries to push back. He submits a revised report, arguing that the bird explanation doesn't match the data. His report is rejected. He's told the case is resolved and further analysis is unnecessary. That's when Hynek begins to understand his real role. He's not there to investigate. He's there to provide scientific cover for predetermined conclusions. In his private notes he writes, "They don't want truth. They want closure. My job is to make the impossible sound ordinary, regardless of evidence." The Lubbock Lights case stays with him for the rest of his life. In later years, after he'd left Blue Book, he would publicly state that the case remained unexplained and that the official explanation was inadequate. But by then, the damage was done. The public believed the case was solved. The Lonnie Zamora incident. If the Lubbock lights troubled Hynek, the Lonnie Zamora incident shattered his remaining skepticism. April 24th, 1964, Socorro, New Mexico. Late afternoon, just before sunset. Police Sergeant Lonnie Zamora is pursuing a speeding car south of town when he hears a loud roar and sees flames in the distance. His first thought is that the dynamite shack on the edge of town has exploded. He abandons the traffic stop and drives toward the site. The terrain is rough, rocky arroyos and scrub brush. Zamora follows a dirt road up a small hill, struggling to keep his patrol car under control on the loose gravel. He reaches the top of the hill and looks down into the arroyo below. What he sees makes no sense. There's an object resting on the ground. It's oval-shaped, white, smooth, about the size of a car, but the proportions are wrong, wider than it is tall. It's resting on metallic legs, 4 of them, arranged like landing struts. Beside the object stand 2 figures. They're small, as Zamora later estimates around 4 feet tall. They're wearing what look like white coveralls or jumpsuits, one-piece garments, no visible seams. Their proportions seem slightly off in ways Zamora can't quite articulate. The head-to-body ratio isn't quite right. Their movements are too quick, too smooth. Zamora is about 150 yards away. He can't see their faces clearly, but he can see them moving around the object, apparently working on something. Then one of them notices him. The figures react immediately. They move quickly, not running exactly, but moving with a strange fluidity, back toward the object. One disappears around the far side. The other seems to climb or step into an opening Zamora can't quite see. Seconds later, the roar returns. Deafening. Zamora describes it as similar to jet engines, but deeper, more resonant. The object begins to glow at the bottom, a bluish-orange flame that doesn't look like combustion. Zamora panics. He thinks it's going to explode. He runs back toward his patrol car, stumbling in the rocks, certain he's about to be incinerated. The roar reaches a crescendo. When Zamora risks a look back, the object is airborne. It hovers briefly, maybe 20 feet off the ground, then begins moving. Not with the acceleration curve of normal aircraft. It goes from hovering to high-speed flight almost instantaneously, moving low across the desert terrain, following the contours of the land. Within seconds, it's gone. Complete silence returns. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes. Zamora immediately radios the sheriff's office. "You're not going to believe what I just saw." Sergeant Sam Chavez arrives within minutes. Together, they go back to the site. The evidence is undeniable. 4 distinct depressions in the hard-packed earth where the landing legs rested. The soil is compressed and shows clear patterns consistent with something heavy bearing down. Burn marks on the desert scrub. Several bushes are charred, still smouldering slightly. The burn patterns are strange, focused in specific areas but not spreading the way a normal fire would. The ground where the object had been is disturbed, smooth in a way that doesn't match the surrounding terrain. Chavez radios for backup. More officers arrive. An FBI agent arrives. The Air Force is notified. Within 24 hours, Project Blue Book dispatches an investigator. Within 48 hours, J. Allen Hynek himself arrives in Socorro. Hynek interviews Zamora extensively. He examines the physical evidence. He talks to other officers who responded. He documents everything meticulously, and he believes Zamora completely. Zamora is a respected officer with 12 years of service. No history of exaggeration, mental instability, or attention-seeking behaviour. He's known in the community as reliable, level-headed, professional. He has nothing to gain from fabricating this story. In fact, he's embarrassed by the attention. He doesn't like talking about it. He's worried it will affect his career. The physical evidence matches his account perfectly. The landing impressions are real. The burn marks are real. The timeline is documented. His radio communications provide a precise record of when he called in the sighting and when other officers arrived. Hynek spends 2 days in Socorro. He walks the site repeatedly. He measures the landing impressions, he interviews witnesses who saw the object from a distance. He checks astronomical data to rule out any conventional explanation. There is no conventional explanation. This wasn't a balloon, it wasn't a helicopter. It was an experimental military craft. The Air Force checked with White Sands Missile Range and Holloman Air Force Base. Nothing was flying in that area at that time. Hynek writes a classified memo to Blue Book headquarters. "This case bothers me deeply. The witness is credible. The evidence is physical and documented. The object described exhibits characteristics beyond any known technology. This may be the most significant case we've encountered. It may be the Roswell of my time." That memo is classified and filed separately from the main Blue Book archive. It never appears in the official reports. Publicly, the case is listed as unidentified, one of the few cases Blue Book couldn't explain away, but the official stance is carefully neutral. We don't know what it was, but there's no evidence it was extraterrestrial. Hynek knows the truth is more complicated. He knows what Zamora saw was real. He knows the object displayed intelligent control and technology far beyond human capability. But he also knows he can't say that publicly without destroying his credibility and his access to future cases. So he does what he's been doing for 16 years. He speaks carefully, hints at the truth, and waits for the day when he might be able to tell the full story. That day never quite comes. The Lonnie Zamora incident remains one of the most credible and well-documented UFO cases in history. Even hardcore skeptics struggle to dismiss it. The witness is too reliable, the evidence too physical, the investigation too thorough. But it also becomes a turning point for Hynek. After Socorro, he can no longer pretend he's dealing with misidentifications and psychological phenomena. Something real is happening. Something that doesn't fit into our understanding of reality. And the people running Project Blue Book know it, which is why they're working so hard to keep cases like this from reaching the public eye. The Unseen Files. Years after Blue Book closed, Air Force Colonel Robert Friend, who served as director of Project Blue Book from 1958 to 1963, began speaking more openly about what the program really was. In a 1998 interview, he confirmed what Hynek had long suspected. Blue Book operated two filing systems. One was public, the reports shared with Congress, the media, civilian researchers, and consultants like Hynek. This archive was carefully curated to present UFO reports as primarily explainable, or at least manageable. The other was classified, a parallel archive containing cases the Air Force considered genuinely sensitive. These cases involved military pilots reporting structured craft during active combat or training missions, radar installations at sensitive facilities tracking objects that couldn't be explained as atmospheric phenomena, incidents near nuclear weapons installations, missile silos and strategic air bases, events where physical evidence was collected, material samples, radiation readings, photographic evidence that suggested advanced technology, cases involving multiple military witnesses whose testimony couldn't be easily dismissed. Friend stated in the interview, "There were reports Hynek never saw. Cases that involved national security implications were handled separately. They went to different departments, different channels. Blue Book was the public face. But the serious cases, the ones that really concerned us, those went elsewhere." When the interviewer asked where those cases went, Friend said he didn't know. That information was above his clearance level. Think about that for a moment. The director of Project Blue Book, the military's official UFO investigation program, didn't have access to the most important cases. This explained so much of what Hynek had experienced. It explained why he often felt like he was investigating half stories. Because he was. It explained why witnesses would sometimes tell him details that weren't in the official reports he'd received. Because the reports had been edited before reaching him. It explained why he could never quite build a comprehensive picture of the phenomenon. Because the most compelling pieces of the puzzle were systematically removed from his view. Hynek was a prop, a scientific facade to give Blue Book credibility, while the real investigations happened in compartmented programs he'd never even hear about. He suspected this during his years with Blue Book, but confirmation wouldn't come until after his death, when researchers began interviewing former military personnel willing to speak more openly. By then, it was too late for Hynek to say, "I told you so." The switch from debunker to believer. By the mid-1960s, Hynek could no longer reconcile what he was being told to say with what he knew to be true. Internally, he was keeping extensive notes documenting the disconnect between evidence and official conclusions. He was quietly networking with other scientists who took the phenomenon seriously. He was beginning to speak more carefully at academic conferences, hinting at the limitations of Blue Book's methodology. But he was still publicly defending the program, still explaining away cases, still playing his assigned role. The breaking point came in March 1966, during what became known as the Michigan UFO wave. Between March 14th and March 21st, dozens of people across southeastern Michigan reported seeing strange lights maneuvering over fields, forests, and residential areas. The witnesses included police officers, college students, local officials, housewives, farmers, a complete cross-section of the community. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Witnesses reported seeing glowing objects that moved erratically, changed colour, hovered in place, then accelerated to high speeds. Some described the objects as disc-shaped. Others saw only the lights. On the night of March 20th, more than 50 people, including 12 police officers, witnessed objects maneuvering over a swampy area near Dexter, Michigan. The objects were seen for several hours. Multiple independent witnesses described the same phenomena. The sightings made national news. Michigan was in an uproar. Congressman Gerald Ford, who represented the area and would later become president, demanded a congressional hearing. The Air Force was under enormous pressure to provide answers. They dispatched Hynek to Michigan to investigate and, more importantly, to make the story go away. Hynek arrived in Ann Arbor on March 23rd. He spent 3 days interviewing witnesses, examining the sites, reviewing reports. The evidence troubled him. These weren't obvious misidentifications. The witnesses were credible. Their accounts were detailed and consistent. The duration of the sightings, hours in some cases, ruled out meteors or aircraft. But the Air Force needed an explanation. Now. The press was calling, Congress was watching, the public was demanding answers. On March 25th, Hynek held a press conference. Standing before a room packed with journalists and television cameras, under pressure from his Air Force handlers, he offered an explanation. Swamp gas. He explained that decaying vegetation in marshland can produce marsh gas, primarily methane, which can spontaneously ignite under certain conditions, creating glowing lights that appear to move. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The press erupted in laughter. Reporters shouted questions. "Are you serious? Swamp gas? That's your explanation?" The witnesses felt betrayed. The police officers who'd risked their credibility by reporting what they saw were humiliated. The scientific community was embarrassed for him. Swamp gas creating lights that multiple trained observers watched for hours, moving in coordinated patterns. It was absurd. Within hours, editorial cartoons were mocking him. Headlines declared Air Force blames UFOs on swamp gas. Late-night comedians made jokes. Hynek became a punchline. The government scientist willing to blame anything, no matter how ridiculous, rather than admit the obvious. But what the public didn't know, what wasn't revealed until years later when Hynek's personal papers were examined, was that he had written a very different report before the press conference. In his internal analysis, submitted to Project Blue Book headquarters 3 days before going public, he'd stated, "The objects described by witnesses exhibited controlled, intelligent movement inconsistent with natural phenomena. They maneuvered with flight characteristics beyond human capability, instant acceleration, stationary hovering, coordinated group behavior." Multiple independent witnesses, including trained observers, provide consistent testimony. Physical evidence includes electromagnetic interference with vehicle ignition systems and compass anomalies. Swamp gas does not adequately explain the observed phenomena. This case deserves serious scientific study, not dismissal. That report was rewritten before release. Hynek was told to stick to the swamp gas explanation or resign from Blue Book. He could have resigned. He could have held the press conference and said, "I don't know what these people saw, but it wasn't swamp gas." He could have maintained his scientific integrity, but he stayed. He gave the explanation they demanded. He became the man who blamed UFOs on swamp gas. Why? In private correspondence years later, Hynek tried to explain his reasoning. He still believed he could do more good inside the system than outside it. He thought that by maintaining his position, he could continue documenting cases, building evidence, preparing for a time when the truth might emerge. He also feared what would happen if he spoke out, not just to his career, but to the phenomenon itself. He worried that if he, the chief scientific consultant to Blue Book, publicly stated that UFOs were real and represented unknown technology, the backlash would set serious research back decades. So he swallowed his pride, accepted the humiliation, and continued playing his role. But something inside him broke that day in Michigan. From that point forward, Hynek began quietly reaching out to other scientists who took the phenomenon seriously. He started building a network outside official channels. He began planning for a time when he would no longer be constrained by Air Force protocols. He also began speaking more carefully but more pointedly at academic conferences and in scholarly papers. He never explicitly contradicted Blue Book's conclusions, but he raised methodological concerns. He questioned whether the investigation was designed to find truth or provide reassurance. Those who understood what he was doing, other researchers, sympathetic colleagues, recognised that Hynek was laying groundwork, building a case, preparing to speak more openly when the time was right. Hynek contacts other scientists. In the late 1960s, as Project Blue Book began its slow decline toward closure, Hynek intensified his outreach to researchers outside the military system. He established correspondence with Jacques Vallée, a French-American computer scientist who was taking a more rigorous data-driven approach to UFO research. Vallée wasn't interested in sensationalism or speculation. He wanted patterns, statistical analysis, cross-cultural comparison. Hynek and Vallée exchanged hundreds of letters over the years. In those letters, carefully worded to avoid revealing classified information, Hynek hinted at the frustrations of working within Blue Book. In a 1967 letter, Hynek wrote, "There are cases the Air Force will not let me classify as unexplained, though they clearly are. I receive reports that have been sanitized, edited, stripped of their most compelling details. It's like trying to study a phenomenon through a filter designed to make it invisible." Vallée later claimed that Hynek believed a hidden intelligence unit was operating within the Air Force, a group tasked with managing UFO incidents in ways that bypassed Blue Book entirely. This wasn't paranoia. Hynek had seen evidence of parallel investigations, cases referenced in internal memos that never appeared in official files, witnesses who mentioned talking to other Air Force investigators, who Hynek never met. Hynek also communicated with James McDonald, an atmospheric physicist from the University of Arizona, who became one of the most vocal scientific critics of Project Blue Book. McDonald was everything Hynek couldn't be: bold, confrontational, willing to publicly challenge the Air Force's conclusions. He testified before Congress, accusing Blue Book of incompetence and deliberate obfuscation. He published papers arguing that UFOs represented a genuine scientific mystery deserving serious study. The Air Force hated McDonald. They viewed him as a threat. They worked behind the scenes to undermine his credibility, questioning his professional judgment, suggesting his UFO research was affecting his scientific work. Hynek admired McDonald's courage, but couldn't publicly align with him. Doing so would have ended his access to Blue Book, and eliminated any influence he had on official investigations. Instead, Hynek supported McDonald privately. He shared data. He confirmed inconsistencies in official reports. He validated McDonald's criticisms while maintaining public neutrality. It was a delicate balance, staying inside the system while supporting those trying to expose its failures. Hynek also exchanged letters with Alan Sandage, one of the world's leading astronomers and Hynek's former colleague from Ohio State. Sandage was skeptical of UFOs but respected Hynek's integrity. In one letter, dated June 1968, Hynek wrote something remarkably candid. "Alan, I no longer believe we are dealing with misidentifications or psychological phenomena. After 20 years of reviewing these cases, I'm convinced something real is interacting with us. The question is not whether the phenomenon exists. It does. The question is, what is it? And why is the government so determined to prevent serious scientific study?" Sandage's response was cautious but supportive. He encouraged Hynek to document everything, to prepare for a time when he could speak more freely. He also warned Hynek to be careful, to avoid saying anything that might give his critics ammunition to destroy his reputation. Through these relationships, Hynek began building what would eventually become a post-Blue Book research network. He was preparing for the day when the official investigation ended and the real work could begin. Blue Book closes, but the questions remain. December 17, 1969. The Air Force officially shuts down Project Blue Book. The decision is based on the Condon Report, a study conducted by the University of Colorado and led by physicist Edward Condon. After 2 years of investigation, Condon concludes, "No evidence that UFOs represent extraterrestrial craft. No evidence that UFOs pose a threat to national security. No scientific value in continued study. The report recommends terminating Blue Book and discontinuing official UFO investigations." The Air Force is thrilled. They've wanted to exit the UFO business for years. The program is a public relations nightmare, a budget drain, a constant source of congressional questions. With Condon's academic blessing, they can finally shut it down. At a press conference, Air Force officials announced Blue Book's closure with barely concealed relief. The official statement is brief. After 22 years of investigation, we have found no evidence that UFOs represent a threat, or that they are vehicles from other worlds. The matter is now considered closed. Hynek attends the press conference. He says nothing. Later, in interviews with mainstream media, he carefully endorses the closure. He tells reporters that most UFO cases can be explained, that the public's fears are unwarranted, that the Air Force made a good faith effort to study the phenomenon. He plays his role one last time. But privately, to fellow researchers and in letters to trusted colleagues, Hynek says something very different. Blue Book was the storefront. The real research continued elsewhere. He explains his theory. The Air Force never stopped investigating UFOs. They simply stopped doing it publicly. The cases that really mattered, the ones involving military encounters, radar confirmations, physical evidence, were never part of Blue Book anyway. They were handled through compartmented programs with higher classification levels. Shutting down Blue Book wasn't about ending UFO research. It was about ending public scrutiny. Think about the logic. If UFOs were genuinely unimportant, why investigate them at all? But if they were genuinely important, if they represented unknown technology or potential threats, would you really conduct that investigation in a public program that published annual reports and answered congressional inquiries? Of course not. You'd create a public program that appeared to investigate while the real work happened in the shadows. Hynek believed Blue Book was always meant to fail. Its purpose was to absorb public attention and criticism while protecting the actual investigations from exposure. After Blue Book closed, Hynek was finally free to speak more openly. In 1973, he founded the Center for UFO Studies, creating an independent civilian database of sightings. He began giving lectures at universities, speaking more candidly about Blue Book's limitations and the cases that troubled him. He published a book, The UFO Experience, in which he developed a classification system for UFO encounters and argued that the phenomenon deserved serious scientific study. He was no longer the government's debunker. He was the phenomenon's most credible advocate, and he was convinced, absolutely convinced, that the truth was far stranger and more complex than anyone publicly acknowledged. The Missing Hynek Files. When J. Allen Hynek died on April 27, 1986, researchers and archivists at the Center for UFO Studies immediately began the process of cataloguing his personal papers. They expected a treasure trove of documentation. Hynek had been meticulous about record-keeping throughout his career. They knew he maintained extensive personal files separate from his official work. Notes, correspondence, case analyses, witness interviews, classified memos he'd managed to copy before returning them. The archive would be invaluable. Decades of first-hand observations from the man who'd been inside Project Blue Book for 22 years. Evidence of the cases they'd never published. Proof of the filtering and manipulation he'd witnessed. What they found was incomplete. Several critical categories of material were missing entirely. His personal notes on the Lonnie Zamora case, gone. These weren't official Blue Book files. These were Hynek's private observations, his interviews with Zamora conducted years after the incident, his analysis of why the case remained unexplainable. He'd referenced these notes in correspondence as recently as 1985. His private Blue Book diary, gone. Hynek had kept a personal journal throughout the 1960s, documenting his daily experiences inside Blue Book. Not the sanitized official reports, but his real thoughts, his frustrations, his observations about how cases were manipulated. He'd shown portions of this diary to close colleagues. It was several hundred pages long, an entire folder labelled 1965 Northeast Radar Incidents. Gone. This folder contained documentation of multiple radar trackings of unknown objects over the northeastern United States during a concentrated period in 1965. These cases never made it into Blue Book's official reports. Hynek had been collecting data independently, building a case that the phenomenon was real and being deliberately ignored. His correspondence with Air Force intelligence officers between 1958 and 1964 gone. Hynek had maintained relationships with several intelligence officers who'd worked adjacent to Blue Book. Some of them had provided him with information about cases handled outside official channels. Their letters were candid, sometimes shockingly so, about the reality of what was happening. A box of witness interviews on audio cassette, gone. In the 1970s and early 80s, Hynek had revisited some of the most significant Blue Book cases, conducting new interviews with witnesses now willing to speak more freely. These recordings contained details that had never been made public. Hynek's family was adamant. The files had been in his office shortly before his death. His wife remembered seeing them when she'd helped him organise his study 3 weeks before he died. His son remembered his father mentioning the Lonnie Zamora notes, specifically in a conversation just days before the heart attack. But within a week of Hynek's death, between the funeral and when the archivists arrived to begin cataloguing, the files disappeared. The family filed inquiries. They contacted the Centre for UFO Studies. They reached out to former colleagues, asking if Hynek had loaned materials to anyone. No one had taken the files, or if they had, they weren't admitting it. Mark Roediger, who became the scientific director of the Centre for UFO Studies, later said, "It felt like someone had surgically removed the most sensitive material. Not everything, just the pieces that would have been most damaging if made public. Whoever took them knew exactly what they were looking for." The official explanation was that Hynek had likely misplaced or destroyed the documents himself in his final years. Perhaps his health had been declining. Perhaps he'd been disorganised. But people who knew Hynek found that impossible to believe. Even in his 70s, he remained sharp, organised, obsessive about documentation. He'd spent 30 years building his archive. He'd talked about it as his legacy, the evidence he'd accumulated for future researchers. Why would he destroy it? And if he'd merely misplaced it, why specifically those files? Why not a random scattering of material? Why precisely the documents that contained the most sensitive information? The alternative explanation, that someone removed the files deliberately, raised darker questions. Who had access to Hynek's home in the days after his death? Who knew what was in his archive and which pieces were most damaging? Who had the motivation to ensure those specific documents never became public? Those questions remain unanswered, but the disappearance of the files became part of Hynek's story. One more suggestion that his suspicions about surveillance and suppression weren't paranoia. The hypothesis Hynek never published in the fragments that remained of Hynek's personal archive, researchers found hints of a theory he'd been developing in his final years, a hypothesis that went far beyond simple aliens from another planet. Based on his notes, private correspondence and conversations recalled by close colleagues, Hynek believed the UFO phenomenon was non-human in origin. Not human technology, not misidentification, not psychological phenomena. Something genuinely other. Technologically superior to anything humans had developed. The flight characteristics alone, instant acceleration, right-angle turns at high speeds, apparent disregard for inertia, suggested technology centuries or millennia ahead of us, intentionally masking itself. The phenomenon appeared in ways that made it difficult to study or prove. It avoided clear, unambiguous encounters. It left just enough evidence to suggest something real, while providing skeptics with plausible deniability, as if it wanted to be seen but not confirmed. Possibly interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial. This was Hynek's most radical conclusion. He'd grown skeptical of the simple, visitors from another planet explanation. The objects didn't behave like scouts or explorers. They didn't follow patterns consistent with scientific observation or resource gathering. They appeared and disappeared in ways that seemed to violate physics, not because they broke physical laws, but because they were using those laws in ways we didn't yet comprehend. In a letter to Jacques Vallée dated November 1983, Hynek wrote, "I increasingly suspect we're dealing with something that exists in a relationship to our reality, that we don't have the conceptual framework to understand. These objects don't travel through space in the conventional sense. They don't seem to come from anywhere and go anywhere. They manifest, they appear, and then they're gone, as if our three-dimensional space is just one layer of a more complex structure. He elaborated on this in a 1985 paper presented to a small group of physicists and theorists. Physical laws are not violated. They are used in ways we do not yet grasp. What appears impossible, instantaneous acceleration, dematerialization, apparent defiance of gravity, may simply reflect our incomplete understanding of physics. Just as quantum mechanics revealed layers of reality invisible to classical physics, perhaps the UFO phenomenon operates in dimensions or states of being we haven't yet discovered. This was radical thinking. It suggested the phenomenon wasn't just advanced technology. It was something far more complex, possibly involving dimensions or realities beyond our current scientific framework. It also explained some of the pattern Hynek had observed over 3 decades. Why the phenomenon never provided clear, unambiguous proof of its existence. Why it seemed to adapt to human perception, appearing in ways that fit cultural expectations. Airships in the 1890s, rockets in the 1940s, sleek saucers in the 50s. Why witness accounts were often surreal, dreamlike, filled with absurd details that made them easy to dismiss, as if the phenomenon was operating in a space where the normal rules of physical reality were more fluid. Why scientific study seemed to make it recede, as if observation itself affected the phenomenon. Hynek never published this hypothesis. He discussed it only with close colleagues, and even then carefully. He knew how it would sound. He knew it would destroy whatever mainstream credibility he had left. The scientific community barely tolerated his advocacy for UFO research as potential extraterrestrial visitation. If he started talking about interdimensional phenomena and reality structures beyond our understanding, he'd be dismissed as a crank. So he kept it private, sharing only with those he trusted to understand the distinction between speculative theory and ungrounded fantasy. But in his final years, he became increasingly convinced this was the right direction. The phenomenon was real, but it was stranger than simple aliens from another planet. It was something that challenged our fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Hynek's final warning. In the weeks before his death, Hynek gave a series of informal talks to small groups of researchers, private gatherings, not publicized, attended by people who had been following the phenomenon for decades. One attendee, a physicist who'd known Hynek since the 1970s, later recounted a conversation that took place at a Chicago restaurant in March 1986, just weeks before Hynek's death. Hynek was reflective that night, almost melancholy. He talked about his years with Blue Book, the cases that still troubled him, the pattern of suppression he'd witnessed. Then he said something the physicist would never forget. The Air Force knew the truth far earlier than they will admit. I'm certain of it now. They had cases in the late 40s and early 50s that were absolutely clear. Multiple witnesses, radar confirmation, physical evidence, cases that couldn't be explained away, and they made a decision. The truth was too destabilizing to reveal. The physicist asked what he meant by destabilizing. Hynek explained, "If you tell people that non-human intelligence is interacting with us, that our understanding of reality is fundamentally incomplete, that the government has been lying for decades, what happens? Religious institutions face challenges to their cosmology. Scientific paradigms crumble. Public trust in government evaporates. Social stability depends on shared assumptions about reality. Pull one thread, and the entire fabric might unravel. They chose containment over disclosure." "Do you think that was the right choice?" someone asked. Hynek was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I don't know. Maybe they genuinely believed they were protecting people from information they weren't ready to handle. Maybe they were right to be cautious, but I think they underestimated humanity. I think people are more resilient than the gatekeepers give them credit for. And I think the cost of secrecy, the cost of allowing this phenomenon to remain unexamined by the full scope of human science, that cost might be higher than the risk of disclosure. Another researcher asked if Hynek thought disclosure would ever happen. "I used to think it would come gradually," Hynek replied. "Slow revelation, careful management. But I'm not sure anymore. The secrecy has gone on so long, the compartmentalization runs so deep, I'm not sure the people currently in charge even know the full picture. The information is scattered across agencies that don't communicate. The institutional memory is fragmented. We might have reached a point where the truth can't be disclosed because no one person or organisation has access to all of it." This was a chilling idea, that the cover-up had become so complex, so bureaucratically distributed, that it had transcended any individual or agency's control. The secrecy had become self-perpetuating, maintaining itself through sheer organisational inertia. Before they left the restaurant that night, Hynek said one more thing. "I've documented what I could. I've left a record. Maybe someday, when the time is right, someone will be able to piece together the full picture. All I can do is leave breadcrumbs and hope someone follows them." 5 weeks later, he was dead. Operation Sentinel. One of the most intriguing and unverified claims about Hynek's final years involves a program allegedly called Operation Sentinel. According to Jerome Davis, a researcher who claims to have spoken with Hynek at a conference in September 1985, Hynek mentioned a classified monitoring program that allegedly continued UFO surveillance after Blue Book ended. Davis's account, published years later in a UFO research journal, describes a conversation where Hynek seemed unusually candid. Perhaps because he was among colleagues, perhaps because he was growing weary of maintaining secrecy. Hynek allegedly said, "Blue Book ended, but the work didn't. There's a program, I don't know what it's officially called, but I've heard it referred to as Sentinel. It's joint CIA and Air Force, with cooperation from NASA and possibly other agencies. It uses advanced surveillance technology that didn't exist when Blue Book was operating." He described what Sentinel allegedly involved: reconnaissance satellites specifically tasked with tracking objects entering and leaving Earth's atmosphere. Not the general surveillance satellites everyone knows about, but specialized systems designed to detect unconventional propulsion signatures and anomalous trajectories. Radar triangulation networks across the continental United States, positioned to provide overlapping coverage and immediate notification when objects moving at unconventional speeds or exhibiting unusual flight characteristics are detected. International reporting systems coordinated with allied nations, Britain, Canada, Australia, potentially others. A data-sharing network that allows for tracking of objects across national boundaries. Automated analysis systems using computer algorithms to filter reports and identify patterns, something that wasn't technologically feasible during Blue Book's operation, but became possible in the 70s and 80s. According to Davis, Hynek claimed he'd heard about Sentinel from a former intelligence officer who'd reached out to him in the late 1970s. The officer was dying of cancer and wanted to unburden himself before the end. They met at a hotel near O'Hare Airport. The meeting lasted less than an hour. The officer, Hynek never revealed his name, described an operation that had been running since the early 70s, shortly after Blue Book's closure. Blue Book was a public relations operation, the officer allegedly told Hynek. Sentinel was the real program. We kept tracking, we kept analysing, we kept investigating. We just stopped telling anyone about it. When Hynek asked why the secrecy was maintained, the officer supposedly replied, "Because the phenomenon never stopped. The sightings continued, the radar trackings continued, and we still don't understand what we're dealing with. But admitting that publicly, after spending 20 years telling everyone there's nothing to worry about, that would be career suicide for everyone involved. There is no official record of Operation Sentinel. No documents have surfaced. No whistleblower has provided corroborating testimony. No budget lines in declassified Air Force spending show a program by that name. But the idea fits perfectly with the pattern Hynek had observed for decades, a public facade covering a secret reality. If Sentinel existed, it would explain several things. Why the Air Force was so comfortable shutting down Blue Book. They didn't need public legitimacy anymore. They could monitor the phenomenon privately, without congressional oversight or media scrutiny. Why credible sighting reports continued to come from military pilots and radar installations after 1969, but no official investigation was conducted. The investigation was happening, just not publicly. Why Hynek remained convinced that the government knew more than it was revealing? Because they did. The investigation never stopped. Some researchers dismiss the Sentinel story as unverifiable rumour. Others point out that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when dealing with classified programs. What's notable is that Hynek, a cautious, methodical scientist, found the story credible enough to mention it to colleagues. He wasn't prone to repeating unverified claims. If he talked about Sentinel, he believed there was something to it. Whether that program existed under that name or something like it existed under a different designation, the central claim seems almost certainly true. The United States government didn't stop investigating UFOs when Blue Book closed. They just stopped doing it in public view. Hynek's legacy. The man who tried to tell us softly. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Hynek began slipping information into public speeches and academic presentations. He'd give a talk about the history of Project Blue Book and then casually mention, there were cases involving objects tracked on radar that Blue Book never officially logged. The data exists, but it was classified at the time and remains so today. Or he'd discuss the methodology of UFO investigation and note, cases involving multiple military witnesses and physical evidence often bypassed Blue Book entirely. They were handled through different channels. I wasn't given access to them. Or he'd talk about the Lonnie Zamora incident and add, I wrote extensive analysis concluding this was a genuine unknown. That analysis was classified. The public version of my conclusions was simplified. He never made explicit accusations. He never named specific agencies or individuals. He never violated his security clearances or revealed classified information. But for those paying attention, researchers who understood the implications, the message was clear. The official story was incomplete. The truth was far more complex and far more troubling. Hynek was leaving a trail, building a case, providing future researchers with hints about where to look and what questions to ask. He also began mentoring younger researchers, passing on his knowledge and connections. He made sure that when he died, there would be people who understood what he'd learned and could continue asking questions. After his death, archivists at the Center for UFO Studies discovered how extensive his network had become. He'd been corresponding with scientists, journalists, military personnel, and intelligence community members across the country and around the world. Many of these correspondents came forward after his death, sharing letters and notes Hynek had sent them. The picture that emerged was of a man conducting a careful, decades-long campaign to preserve evidence and build support for serious scientific study, all while navigating the constraints of his security clearances and professional reputation. One archivist at QFOS said there were files he could never show publicly, and they vanished the same week he died. But he'd been preparing for that possibility. He'd shared information with enough people, in enough different places, that the core of what he knew survived even if the physical documents didn't. The question was whether anyone would be able to piece together the fragments he'd left behind. The real story is in the cases they never let him touch. Researchers estimate that approximately 20% of Project Blue Book's data was never made public. This isn't speculation. It's based on comparisons between the number of cases Blue Book officially investigated, 12,618, references in internal military documents to cases that don't appear in Blue Book's published reports, testimony from military personnel who filed UFO reports that never showed up in the official archive, analysis of Blue Book's case numbering system, which shows gaps suggesting removed cases. These were the cases involving military pilots reporting structured craft with no visible propulsion during active flight operations, not training exercises where misidentification might be understandable, but combat-ready pilots on routine patrol who encountered objects that outmaneuvered their aircraft. radar operators tracking objects accelerating from stationary hover to thousands of miles per hour in seconds. Not atmospheric anomalies or equipment glitches, but solid returns tracked across multiple systems, sometimes visually confirmed by pilots. Incidents near nuclear installations, missile silos and strategic air bases, sightings that occurred over the most sensitive military facilities, suggesting intelligence rather than random encounters. Events with physical evidence, scorched earth, radiation readings above background levels, electromagnetic interference with vehicle ignition and electronic systems, material samples that couldn't be identified, cases involving multiple categories of evidence simultaneously, visual sighting plus radar confirmation, plus physical effects, plus multiple witnesses. The cases where everything lined up and no conventional explanation fit. Hynek was systematically excluded from these cases. When he asked about them, he was told they involved national security. When he pressed for access, he was told the evidence was inconclusive or that the witnesses were unreliable. This despite some witnesses being highly trained military personnel with impeccable service records. He knew the pattern. The best evidence was always classified, always buried, always kept just out of reach. In his final interview with Rebecca Marks, Hynek said, "The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. That data still exists somewhere, locked in archives, hidden in compartmented programs, scattered across intelligence agencies that don't communicate with each other. Maybe it's in an Air Force vault at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where Project Blue Book was headquartered. Maybe it's in CIA archives, filed under counterintelligence rather than aerial phenomena. Maybe it's in the National Reconnaissance Office, mixed in with satellite surveillance data. Maybe it's distributed across multiple agencies, each holding pieces of a puzzle none of them can see completely. And maybe, just maybe, there are people inside those agencies who know the full truth. People who've seen the evidence Hynek never could. People who understand what's been interacting with us for decades. People who carry the same burden Hynek carried, knowing something that changes everything but being unable to speak. The question is, will they ever tell us? Or will the phenomenon remain what it's always been? Something we glimpse, something we document, something we can never quite prove. A reality that exists in the gap between what we can observe and what we can conclusively demonstrate. J. Allen Hynek spent 30 years trying to answer that question. He started as a debunker and ended as a believer. He worked for the government and was betrayed by it. He maintained his scientific reputation while quietly building a case for the phenomenon's reality. He wanted to tell the truth but was trapped by classification, career pressures, and the knowledge that some truths destroy the people who speak them too directly. In the end, he did what he could. He left clues. He built networks. He spoke carefully but persistently. He documented everything he could, knowing that someday someone might be able to piece together what he'd learned. And then he died. 3 months after giving an interview that someone thought was dangerous enough to erase. The tape is gone. But the questions remain. What did Hynek really know? What was in those missing files? Who decided the public couldn't handle the truth? And most importantly, is the phenomenon still active? Are unknown objects still being tracked, investigated, documented in classified programs we'll never hear about? Maybe someday we'll find out. Maybe the truth will emerge gradually through freedom of information requests and whistleblower testimony. Maybe some future equivalent of Hynek will decide the time has come to speak openly. Consequences be damned. Or maybe, like so many things in this field, we'll be left with fragments, hints, and the growing suspicion that reality is far stranger than we've been allowed to believe. One thing is certain, J. Allen Hynek believed the phenomenon was real. After 3 decades of study, after seeing the evidence firsthand, after witnessing the suppression and manipulation, he was convinced. And if someone with his credentials, his experience, his access to classified data came to that conclusion, maybe the rest of us should pay attention. Because if he was right, if the government really has been hiding the truth for 70 years, then we're living in a reality fundamentally different from the one we've been told exists, and that changes everything. This is Sleep Theories, where documented truth is stranger than fiction. Sleep well, and keep asking questions. Because somewhere, in a classified vault, in a forgotten archive, in the memory of aging intelligence officers who'll carry secrets to their graves, the truth is waiting. The truth J. Allen Hynek spent his life trying to reveal. The truth about what's been visiting us, watching us, studying us. The truth we're still not allowed to know, but someday, maybe we will. Someday. What if I told you that beneath the frozen ground of northern Sweden, in the shadows of the world's largest iron ore mine, lies a secret so profound that governments have spent decades ensuring you'll never believe it's real? Tonight's story isn't just fiction, it's woven from threads of actual places, real government programs, and documents that vanished from public archives. Before we descend into the darkness beneath Kiruna, I want to thank Jackman for suggesting this incredible topic, along with all of you who've been sending in these mind-bending story ideas. Keep them coming in the comments below, and if you're enjoying these late-night journeys into the unknown, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Now, dim your lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a story that will make you question what truly lies beneath our feet. Act 1. The Inheritance. The Stockholm rain hammered against the window of Lucas Eklund's cramped apartment, each droplet a tiny percussion in the symphony of another grey October morning. At 32, Lucas had already lived more lives than most embedded with peacekeepers in Kosovo, documenting refugee camps in Syria, chasing stories through the labyrinthian corridors of European bureaucracy. Now he sat at a desk cluttered with unpaid bills and half-finished articles, the glamorous life of a foreign correspondent reduced to freelance assignments about sustainable forestry and Nordic tech startups. The knock at his door came at 7:43 a.m, too early for deliveries, too late for the newspaper boy who still anachronistically served his building. Through the peephole, Lucas saw an elderly man in a wool coat, water streaming from the brim of his hat. Mr. Eklund? The voice was gravelly, tinged with the particular Swedish accent of someone who'd learned English from BBC broadcasts in the 1960s. My name is Gunnar Hedström. I was an editor at Aftonbladet until 1998. I have something that belonged to Ole K. The name stopped Lucas cold. Ole K. Ole Kinberg had been a legend in Swedish journalism circles. A man who'd spent the 1990s chasing stories about government black sites and military experiments only to disappear in 2001. Some said he'd been bought off, others that he'd been driven mad by his own theories. The official story was a hiking accident in Lapland. Body never recovered. Gunnar stood in Lucas's living room, dripping steadily onto the worn hardwood. From a leather satchel he produced a package wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax an oddly archaic touch that made Lucas's journalistic instincts twitch. Ole gave this to me 3 weeks before he disappeared, Gunnar said, his rheumy eyes fixed on the package. told me to hold it for 20 years, then find someone who wouldn't be afraid to look deeper. Your work in Kosovo, the piece about the chemical weapons that NATO denied, Ola would have respected that. The package was heavier than it looked. Inside, Lucas found 3 cassette tapes, their labels faded but legible. Interview 1, January 17th, 1999. Interview 2, January 24th, 1999. And Background Must Listen First. There was also a manila folder containing photocopied documents, some in Swedish, others in English, many with sections heavily redacted. But it was the small notebook that made his hands tremble slightly, page after page of coordinates, each accompanied by cryptic notes. Ventilation, shaft blocked 1994. Emergency access magnetic anomaly. Primary entrance 67.8558 degrees north, 20.2253 degrees east. That last set of coordinates, Lucas knew without checking, pointed to Kiruna, home to the world's largest underground iron ore mine, a city literally being relocated piece by piece as mining operations caused the ground to subside. "Why now?" Lucas asked, looking up at Gunnar. The old man was already at the door. "Because they're about to tear down the old Kiruna completely. Whatever Oli found, if it's still there, it won't be for much longer." Alone again, Lucas loaded the first tape into an ancient cassette player he'd bought from a flea market years ago. The voice that emerged was calm, measured, speaking accented English, with the precision of someone who had learned it as a second language. "My name is not important. What matters is what I have seen, what I know to be true despite all attempts to convince me otherwise. I worked as a contractor for the Swedish Geological Survey from 1987 to 1999. My specialty was deep earth acoustics using sound waves to map underground formations. In the winter of 1990, my team was assigned to a project near Kiruna, supposedly to assess ground stability for future mining operations." The voice paused, and Lucas could hear the distinctive sound of a cigarette being lit indoor smoking, another relic of a bygone era. "What we found beneath Kiruna had nothing to do with iron ore. The chambers were already there, had been there for much longer than any human mining operation. The military knew. They'd known since at least 1969, when the first deep core samples brought up materials that couldn't be explained, alloys that shouldn't exist, organic residues that predated any known life in the region by millions of years." Lucas paused the tape, his coffee growing cold in his hand. He'd heard plenty of conspiracy theories in his career, had even chased a few. But something about the voice, the matter-of-fact delivery, devoid of the usual paranoid energy of conspiracy theorists, made him continue listening. "I was part of a joint operation between the Swedish Ministry of Defence and a NATO working group called Project Deepwatch. Officially, we were mapping potential nuclear waste storage sites. Unofficially, we were documenting a vast network of chambers and tunnels that showed clear signs of artificial construction. Not human construction. The walls were smooth, melted somehow, with a glass-like finish that our engineers couldn't replicate, and the inscriptions..." Another pause, longer this time. "The inscriptions were in no language our linguistics experts could identify. But they were clearly a language structured, repetitive, with what appeared to be mathematical formulas integrated into the text. We took thousands of photographs. All were confiscated in 1999 when the project was suddenly terminated." The tape clicked off, leaving Lucas in silence broken only by the rain against his window. He spent the next 3 hours going through the documents. Most were mundane budget allocations, personnel transfers, equipment requisitions, but scattered throughout were anomalies that made his pulse quicken. A 1993 Swedish Defence Ministry budget that included a line item for specialised underground environment research with an allocation of 47 million kroner, roughly 5 million euros in today's money. A memo from 1994 discussing unexpected biological samples from Site K7 and the need for enhanced containment protocols. A heavily redacted email chain from 1998 with visible fragments. Acoustic signature confirms. NATO liaison demands full disclosure, and most intriguingly, the Lacerta transcript must be secured. Lacerta. The word was familiar, though Lucas couldn't immediately place it. A quick internet search brought up the expected results. the genus name for various lizard species. But deeper in the search results, he found something else. References to an alleged interview with a reptilian being named Lacerta, conducted in Sweden in December 1999. Most sources treated it as obvious fiction, creative writing dressed up as truth. But the timing, the location... Lucas looked at the notebook again, at Ole's careful handwriting. Below the Kiruna coordinates was a single line. She was real. I met her. God help me, she was real. The rational part of Lucas's mind, the part trained by years of journalism, told him this was elaborate nonsense. Underground chambers could be explained by geological processes. Strange inscriptions might be pareidolia seeing patterns where none existed. The budget items could be Cold War paranoia, Sweden's attempt to keep pace with superpower military research. But old Kinberg had been neither gullible nor insane. He'd broken stories about illegal arms sales to Iraq, about corporate corruption at the highest levels of Swedish industry. If Ole had believed something was beneath Kiruna, there was at least enough there to investigate. Lucas picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he wanted. Eric Lindqvist, a cameraman who'd worked with him in Bosnia and now did freelance documentary work. Eric, it's Lucas. How do you feel about a trip to Kiruna? I've got a documentary idea about the mining industry. In October. It's already starting to freeze up there. That's the point. We want to capture the harsh conditions, the isolation. Plus, I've got a new angle, the human impact of the city relocation. Eric was silent for a moment. You're chasing something else, aren't you? Maybe. Can you be ready in 3 days? I'll bring the thermal cameras. If you're going full conspiracy theorist on me, we might as well do it properly. After ending the call, Lucas returned to the cassette player and inserted the second tape. This time the voice was different, older, more hesitant, speaking Swedish, with a distinct Sami accent. The recording quality was poorer, with wind noise in the background suggesting an outdoor interview. I was 12 when I first saw them, the voice said. This was 1971. My father was a reindeer herder, and we were following our herd near Tornatrask. There was a snowstorm coming, and we needed shelter. Father knew of some caves in the hillside, old places our people had used for generations. But that night the caves were occupied. Can you describe what you saw? Ole's voice, younger but recognisable. Lights first. Blue-white like LED, but this was long before LED. And figures tall, too thin, moving wrong. Father grabbed me and we ran. We never spoke of it, but he never took the herd that way again. Years later, when I was working at the mine, I met others who'd seen things. The company brought in special teams whenever we broke through into certain chambers. They'd seal the area, no local workers allowed. They said it was for radiation safety, but we never detected any radiation. The tape continued, but Lucas's attention was drawn to a photograph that had fallen from the folder. It showed a group of men in military uniform standing in front of what appeared to be a mine entrance. The photo was dated August 1994. One face he recognised immediately, General Carl Nordstrom, who'd later become Sweden's Chief of Defence. Another took him longer to place, but when he did, his breath caught. It was a younger version of Lars Henriksen, currently Sweden's Minister of Defence. Whatever had happened in Kiruna, it reached to the highest levels of Swedish government. Act 2. Following the coordinates. 3 days later, Lucas stood in the Kiruna airport watching his breath fog in the minus 15-degree air. October in Lapland was a liminal time too late for the midnight sun, too early for the tourist-friendly winter darkness. The town sprawled before him, a monument to human stubbornness built on ground that was literally collapsing beneath it. Eric met him at the rental car station, his van already loaded with equipment. I did some research after your call, Eric said as they drove toward the town centre. Kiruna's even stranger than I remembered. They're not just relocating buildings, they're moving the entire town 3 kilometres east. The official reason is ground subsidence from mining, but the pattern of collapses doesn't match normal mining degradation. What do you mean? Mining subsidence is predictable, you can model it based on extraction patterns. But Kiruna has had collapses in areas that should be stable, while some heavily mined areas remain intact. It's like something else is causing selective instability. They checked into a small hotel on the outskirts of town, one of the few that would survive the relocation. The owner, a weathered woman named Astrid, eyed their equipment with suspicion. "Documentary filmmakers?" she asked in English, noting their Stockholm accents. "About the mining industry and the town relocation," Lucas confirmed. Astrid's expression softened slightly. "Good. Someone should document what we're losing. This town has secrets, you know. Stories the mining company doesn't want told." "What kind of stories?" She glanced around the empty lobby, then leaned closer. "My grandfather worked the mines in the 1940s. He used to tell us about the old tunnels, the ones that were here before LKAB started mining. The company says they're natural formations, but Grandfather swore they were cut too straight, too smooth. And the sounds... Sounds? Like singing, but not human. The miners called it mountain music. Company banned anyone from talking about it in the 1960s. Said it was just acoustic effects from the mining equipment, but the old-timers knew better." That evening, Lucas and Eric visited the local library, searching through newspaper archives. The librarian, a young man named Marcus, was helpful but curious about their specific interest in 1990s military activity. "Not many people ask about that period," Marcus said, pulling out boxes of archived newspapers. "There was a media blackout on military exercises here from 1992 to 1999. National security, they said. But my uncle was a journalist for the local paper then. He always said there was more to it." The archives revealed a pattern. Throughout the 1990s, there were repeated mentions of geological surveys and stability assessments, conducted by teams that included an unusual number of non-Swedish personnel. One article from 1994, buried on page 7, caught Lucas's attention. "Unexplained Tremors Puzzle Scientists." The article described a series of underground vibrations detected by seismic equipment, occurring at depths far below any mining activity. A geology professor from Uppsala University was quoted saying the tremors showed characteristics inconsistent with natural tectonic activity. The professor, Lucas noted, had retired abruptly 6 months after the article was published. The next morning they drove to the coordinates from Oll's notebook. The first 3 locations were disappointment-sealed mine entrances, now behind chain-link fences marked with LKAB logos and no trespassing signs. But the 4th set of coordinates led them off the main road, down a forestry track that hadn't been maintained in years. The track ended at a concrete structure partially hidden by overgrowth. It looked like a bunker entrance from World War II, but the concrete was too new, the design too modern. A sign, faded but legible, read, "Geological Survey Station 7 authorised personnel only." Below it, almost invisible unless you knew to look, was another sign, a radiation hazard symbol accompanied by text warning of "Electromagnetic Field Hazard Pacemaker Warning." "Radiation and EM fields from a geological survey station," Eric muttered, filming the signs. "That's unusual." The entrance was sealed with a heavy steel door, but air vents on either side suggested the structure extended underground. Lucas made notes while Eric filmed, but they were interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. A white SUV with government plates stopped beside their van. The woman who emerged was in her 40s, blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the kind of expensive outdoor clothing that suggested government expense accounts rather than personal purchase. "You're on restricted property," she said in accented English, clearly having noted their rental car's Stockholm plates. "We're documentary filmmakers," Lucas replied, noting that she hadn't identified herself. "Researching the history of mining in the region." "This has nothing to do with mining." She studied them with pale blue eyes that missed nothing. "My name is Elle. I work for the Geological Survey. This is a decommissioned monitoring station from a 1990s research project. There's nothing here of interest to filmmakers." "Elle?" Eric asked. "Just Elle?" She smiled thinly. "In my line of work, full names are a luxury. Now, I need you to leave. This area is still contaminated from old experiments. Nothing dangerous if you leave now, but prolonged exposure wouldn't be advisable." "What kind of experiments?" Lucas pressed. "The classified kind." Her tone remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath it. the kind that curious journalists sometimes misinterpret, leading to embarrassment for everyone involved. You seem intelligent, Mr. Eklund. Yes, I know who you are. Your work in Kosovo was admirable. But this isn't Kosovo. This is sovereign Swedish territory, and you're trespassing. As they prepared to leave, Elle added almost casually, if you're truly interested in the mining industry's impact, you should interview the old-timers at the Kalixelven retirement home. They have wonderful stories about the early days of LKAB, much more suitable for your documentary than classified government research. The drive back to Kiruna was silent until Eric finally spoke. She knew your name. She knew we were coming, Lucas corrected. Someone's been watching since we arrived. Maybe since before. The retirement home suggestion was that a threat or actual advice? Only one way to find out. The Kalixelven retirement home was a modern facility on the edge of town, one of the buildings scheduled for relocation. The staff were helpful, directing them to a common room where several elderly residents gathered for afternoon coffee. Lucas had expected to work slowly up to his real questions, but an elderly man named Niels Persson cut straight through his cover story. You're not here about regular mining, Niels said, his voice still strong despite his 91 years. You're here about the deep work, the tunnels that weren't supposed to exist. The room fell silent. Other residents shifted uncomfortably, but Niels continued. I was a shaft engineer from 1952 to 1987. We broke through into the first anomalous chamber in 1969, 1,200 metres down, far below any natural cave formation should exist at that latitude. The walls were smooth as glass, curved in ways that hurt your eyes to follow. Management immediately classified it, brought in government types. But I saw the photographs before they were confiscated. Photographs of what? Lucas asked. Machines. Or what looked like machines. Crystalline structures that couldn't be natural but predated any human presence by millennia. And bones not human, but not any animal we recognised either. Long, with the wrong number of joints. An elderly woman, Ingrid, spoke up. My husband worked security for the Special Projects Division in the 1990s. He never talked about it, but he had nightmares. Kept saying they're still down there in his sleep. When he retired, they made him sign papers, threatened our pensions if he ever spoke about what he'd seen. Did anyone ever try to go public? Eric asked, camera rolling. Old Kinberg did, Niels replied, and Lucas's pulse quickened. Came here in 1999, asking the same questions you are. We told him what we knew, gave him names, dates. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Hiking accident, they said. But Ol was no hiker. He was murdered for getting too close to the truth. What truth? Lucas pressed. Niels looked around the room, then back at Lucas. That we're not alone on this planet. That we never have been. And that our government has been hiding evidence of a parallel civilization that exists beneath our feet. The Kiruna mine didn't discover them, it disturbed them. And now, with the deep drilling, with the town relocation, they're trying to seal it all away before anyone realises what's really down there. That night, Lucas listened to the third tape from Ole's collection. This one was different, Ole himself speaking, apparently recording notes for a story he never got to write. The Lacerta interview changes everything. If it's real, and my source insists it is, then the chambers beneath Kiruna aren't archaeological sites. They're active habitations. The being calling itself Lacerta claimed to be part of a species that evolved on Earth millions of years before humans, driven underground by a catastrophe they won't specify. She said there are 7 major colonies worldwide, with the Nordic colony being one of the oldest. Ole's voice grew more agitated as the recording continued. The government knows. NATO knows. They've been monitoring the situation since at least 1969, possibly earlier. The electromagnetic anomalies aren't from the mythical beings themselves, but from their technology, some kind of field generation that interferes with human electronics. That's why so many military projects in the area have been classified. They're not studying them, they're negotiating with them. The tape ended with Ole's final words. I'm going back to Kiruna tomorrow. My contact says they've agreed to let me document one of the chambers. If something happens to me, these tapes are my insurance. The world needs to know. Act 3. The Leak. Lucas stared at his laptop screen, the cursor blinking in the empty text field of a secure messaging app. For 3 days he'd debated what to do with the information he'd gathered. The journalist in him wanted to publish everything immediately, but the skeptic demanded more proof. The photographs from the retirement home interviews, the government surveillance, L's thinly veiled warnings, it all suggested something significant, but none of it proved the existence of an underground civilization. He decided to test the waters. Using a pseudonymous account, he posted a carefully edited portion of his findings to an obscure forum dedicated to European military history. He included the budget documents showing the 47 million kroner allocation, the memo about unexpected biological samples, and a brief description of the sealed facilities around Kiruna. He made no mention of reptilian beings or ancient civilizations, framing it instead as potential evidence of illegal biological weapons research. The response was immediate and alarming. Within 30 minutes his post was deleted. Within an hour his laptop screen flickered and went black. When it restarted, his hard drive had been wiped clean, not just formatted, but overwritten with random data in a way that made recovery impossible. Only his external backup drive, disconnected and hidden in his hotel room safe, remained intact. Eric found him staring at the blank screen. What happened? Someone just demonstrated their reach, Lucas replied. Professional data destruction executed remotely. This isn't some local cover-up. This is intelligence service level capability. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Swedish country code. Mr. Eklund, the voice was male, cultured, speaking Swedish with a slight Stockholm accent. Your recent online activities have attracted attention. I represent certain interests that would prefer to handle this matter quietly. Who is this? Someone offering you an opportunity. There's a restaurant called Arktiska. Be there in 1 hour, come alone, bring your backup drive. The line went dead. Arktiska was nearly empty when Lucas arrived. A man in his 50s sat in a corner booth, expensive suit incongruous in the casual restaurant. He gestured for Lucas to sit. My name is irrelevant, the man began, but my authority is not. I represent a working group that coordinates between Swedish intelligence, the military, and certain international partners. Your investigation has touched upon matters of national security. Biological weapons research is illegal under international law, Lucas countered. The man smiled. Is that what you think this is about? Mr. Eklund, what would you say if I told you that everything in those documents you found is true, but your interpretation is completely wrong? He produced a tablet, swiping through images that made Lucas's breath catch. Underground chambers with impossibly smooth walls, crystalline structures that looked both organic and mechanical, and clearest of all, a wall covered in symbols that definitely represented some form of writing. These are from the 1994 expedition, the man explained. What we found predates human civilization by at least 65 million years. Not weapons research, Mr. Eklund. Archaeology. Xenoarchaeology, to be precise. You're saying? I'm saying that in 1969, the Kiruna mine broke through into a network of artificial chambers that shouldn't exist. Since then, we've been trying to understand what we found. The biological samples weren't weapons, they were remains. Preserved tissue from beings that weren't human, but were undeniably intelligent. The man leaned forward. Your old Kinberg got closer to the truth than anyone outside the program. His Lacerta interview, we know he met someone or something. We've been trying to find his contact ever since. That's why we've allowed you to continue your investigation. We hoped you might lead us to answers. If this is all legitimate archaeology, why the secrecy? Why the surveillance? Because humanity isn't ready. Can you imagine the panic if people learned they weren't Earth's first intelligent species? The religious implications alone would destabilize entire nations. We're not hiding the truth forever, just until we understand it better. And if I refuse to stop my investigation... The man's expression hardened. Then you'll find your life becoming very difficult. Not threats, Mr. Eklund, just reality. Your freelance contracts will dry up. Your visa applications for international work will be denied. You'll become, quite simply, unemployable in journalism. He stood, leaving a flash drive on the table. This contains enough classified material to satisfy your curiosity without endangering national security. Take it, study it, then decide whether the story you want to tell is worth the price you'll pay for telling it. Back in his hotel room, Lucas examined the flash drive's contents with Eric. It contained hundreds of documents, photographs, and video files. Most were technical geological surveys, chemical analyses of unknown alloys, linguistic studies of the inscriptions. But buried in the files was something extraordinary. Thermal imaging from 2011 showing vast chambers beneath Kiruna, some large enough to hold entire buildings, all connected by a network of tunnels that extended for kilometres. "This is incredible," Eric breathed. "If this is real..." "It's real," Lucas said. "The question is whether it's complete. They're showing us what they want us to see, not necessarily everything." His phone buzzed. Another unknown number, but this time the message was in English. "They're lying. The chambers aren't abandoned. Check the thermal imaging for heat signatures they missed. 67.8691 degrees north, 20.2156 degrees east. Midnight. Come alone." Lucas showed Eric the message. It could be a trap, or it could be Ole's source, the one he called Lacerta. They spent the rest of the day analysing the thermal imaging. Eric had experience with photographic analysis from his documentary work, and he found what the anonymous sender had suggested: subtle heat signatures in some of the chambers, patterns that suggested active thermal management rather than natural geothermal activity. "Someone's editing these images," Eric concluded. "Not crudely, this is professional work, but there are artifacts from the manipulation. Original heat sources have been masked." As midnight approached, Lucas prepared to meet his mysterious contact. The coordinates led to an abandoned mining equipment warehouse on the outskirts of town. Eric wanted to accompany him, but Lucas insisted on following the instructions. The warehouse was dark, lit only by moonlight streaming through broken windows. Lucas waited, every sound making him tense. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Elle, the government geologist. But something about her was different, her movements too fluid, her eyes reflecting light in a way human eyes shouldn't. "You're very persistent, Mr. Eklund," she said, but her voice had changed, taking on harmonics that made his skin crawl. Ole was the same way. It killed him, you know. Not literally, we don't harm humans unless absolutely necessary, but the knowledge broke something in him. You're not human." She smiled, and for a moment her features seemed to shift, becoming something else before snapping back to human appearance. "I'm as human as I choose to appear. We've been practicing for millennia. Some of us can pass perfectly, others less so." The Lacerta interview, it was real. Real is a complicated concept. The being Ole interviewed was real, yes, but much of what she told him was simplified, sanitized for human consumption. We're not reptilian in the way you understand, that's just how your pattern recognition interprets us. We're something older, something that doesn't fit your taxonomies. Why reveal yourself to me? Because the government's plan is failing. The deep drilling, the town relocation, they think they can seal us away, pretend we don't exist. But we've been here longer than your species has existed. We'll be here long after you're gone. The question is whether we coexist peacefully, or whether fear and ignorance lead to tragedy. She handed him a metal cylinder, about the size of a flashlight but covered in the same symbols from the underground chambers. "This contains our real history. Not the fiction we fed Olor, but the truth about what we are, where we came from, and why we stayed hidden. Your technology can't read it yet, but in time, when you're ready, it will reveal itself. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't. But consider this: if we wanted to harm humanity, we've had 65 million years to do it. We've watched you evolve, watched you spread across the planet, watched you dig deeper and deeper into our domain. We've never interfered. We just want to be left alone. The government thinks the chambers are abandoned." Elle laughed, a sound that wasn't quite human. "They see what we allow them to see. The chambers they found are the ones we abandoned centuries ago. Our real cities are deeper, shielded in ways your technology can't penetrate. But the mining is getting closer, and we're running out of places to retreat. So what do you want from me? Tell the truth, but tell it carefully. If you frame this as alien invasion or conspiracy theory, no one will believe you, and you'll be dismissed as another crackpot. But if you focus on the verifiable facts, the government cover-up, the military involvement, the suppression of archaeological discoveries, you might just open enough minds to prevent a catastrophe. She turned to leave, then paused. Ole asked me once what we feared most about discovery. I told him it wasn't human violence we've survived worse. It's human curiosity. Once you know we exist, you'll never stop trying to find us, study us, understand us. And in doing so, you might destroy both our civilizations. Act 4. The Descent. The meeting with Elle, or whatever she truly was, left. Lucas shaken but determined. He had 3 pieces of evidence now. The government documents, the thermal imaging showing active heat signatures, and the mysterious cylinder. The first 2 could be verified and potentially published. The third remained an enigma, its surface symbols seeming to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Eric had spent the night analysing the thermal imaging data while Lucas was at the warehouse. His findings were disturbing. "Look at this," Eric said, pointing to his laptop screen. "The heat signatures follow a pattern, regular intervals, consistent temperatures. This isn't random geothermal activity, it's climate control. Someone or something is maintaining specific temperatures in those chambers." "The government has to know," Lucas mused. "The data came from their servers. Unless they're not looking for it. If you expect empty archaeological sites, you might explain away heat signatures as equipment malfunction or natural phenomena. But if you know something's living down there..." They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Lucas checked the peephole to find Marcus, the librarian, looking nervous and carrying a cardboard box. "I'm sorry to bother you," Marcus said when Lucas let him in. "But my uncle, the journalist I mentioned, he died last week. Heart attack, they said, but he was healthy as a horse. Before he died, he told me if anyone came asking about the 1990s military activity, I should give them this." The box contained notebooks, photographs, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps. Marcus's uncle had been documenting unusual activities around Kiruna for decades, creating a parallel history to the official narrative. One map in particular caught Lucas's attention. It showed the mine's official layout overlaid with additional passages marked in red ink. A note in the margin read, "Ventilation tunnels sealed 1994-1997. Still accessible through maintenance shaft 7. Guards posted until 2001, then abandoned." "Your uncle explored these tunnels?" Lucas asked. "He tried to, several times. Got caught twice, warned off by military police. But he said there was one route they missed, an old ventilation shaft from the 1950s that connected to the newer system. It's how the workers used to sneak out for unauthorised breaks." Marcus pulled out a photograph, grainy but clear enough. It showed a massive underground space, lit by what appeared to be industrial lighting. But the walls weren't rough rock, they were smooth, almost organic looking, with the same glassy finish described by the witnesses at the retirement home. "When was this taken?" 2003. My uncle managed to get about 200 metres into the restricted area before he heard something that scared him off. He never went back, but he said what he saw changed his entire worldview. That evening, Lucas and Eric made a decision that would either vindicate their investigation or end very badly. Using Marcus's uncle's maps and the coordinates from Ole's notebook, they planned an unauthorised exploration of the sealed tunnels. They prepared carefully. Eric had thermal cameras, air quality monitors, and enough battery power for 8 hours of recording. Lucas carried copies of all their evidence, ready to upload to multiple cloud servers if they found anything significant. They also left detailed notes with Marcus, instructions to release everything to international media if they didn't return within 12 hours. Maintenance shaft 7 was exactly where the map indicated, hidden behind a derelict equipment shed 3 kilometres from the main mining complex. The lock had been cut years ago and never replaced, suggesting they weren't the first unauthorised visitors. The descent was easier than expected. The shaft had a ladder, rusty but solid, and the air, while stale, was breathable. 50 metres down they reached a horizontal tunnel, clearly part of the original mine ventilation system. But after another 100 meters, everything changed. The rough mining tunnel gave way to something else entirely. The walls became smooth, curved in impossible ways that seemed to defy three-dimensional geometry. The temperature rose noticeably, and their equipment began registering electromagnetic anomalies. "Are you getting this?" Lucas whispered, though the tunnel seemed to swallow sound. Eric nodded, panning his camera across surfaces that appeared to shimmer with an inner light. "The thermal readings are off the charts. Something's generating massive amounts of heat below us." They continued deeper, following the main passage as it spiraled downward. After what felt like hours, but was only 30 minutes according to their watches, they emerged into a vast chamber that took their breath away. The space was enormous, larger than any cathedral, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. But it wasn't the size that stunned them, it was the structures. Crystalline formations that were clearly artificial rose from the floor like frozen waterfalls, pulsing with soft blue-white light. Along the walls, those same indecipherable symbols they'd seen in photographs were carved deep into the rock, some glowing faintly. "This is it," Eric breathed, filming everything. "This is what they've been hiding." They explored the chamber methodically, documenting everything. In one corner they found equipment abandoned by previous expeditions. Swedish military crates dated 1994, a NATO surveillance station that looked like it had been hastily evacuated, and most remarkably a modern computer terminal that was still functioning, powered by cables that disappeared into the wall. Lucas activated the terminal. It required no password, displaying files in Swedish and English. Most were sensor readings, temperature, radiation levels, seismic activity. But one folder, labelled Contact Protocols, contained something extraordinary. Video files, dozens of them, dated between 1994 and 2011. Lucas opened the most recent. The screen showed this very chamber, but occupied. Military personnel in hazmat suits were setting up equipment, while a figure stood in the centre, tall, too thin, with movements that weren't quite human. The figure wore a hooded robe that obscured its features, but when it turned toward the camera, its eyes reflected light like a cat's. A Swedish officer approached the figure, speaking English. "We need more time. The mining company is pushing to expand operations." The figure's response was in accented English, but with those strange harmonics L had demonstrated. "Time is what we've given you for 50 years. We cannot retreat further. The deep chambers are our last refuge. If the public learns, then perhaps it's time they did. Secrecy has served neither of our species well." The video cut off abruptly. Lucas quickly copied everything onto multiple drives, his hands shaking with the magnitude of what they'd found. A sound echoed through the chamber footsteps, many of them approaching from the tunnel they'd entered through. Eric grabbed his equipment. "We need to go. Now." But as they turned to leave, they found their exit blocked. A squad of Swedish military personnel emerged from the tunnel, weapons drawn but not quite aimed at them. Behind the soldiers walked a familiar figure, the man from the restaurant, still in his expensive suit despite the underground environment. "Mr. Eklund, Mr. Lindqvist," he said calmly, "you've been remarkably resourceful. Unfortunately, you've also committed several crimes, including trespassing on classified military property and theft of state secrets." "This needs to be public," Lucas argued. "People have a right to know." "Do they? Do people have a right to information that could cause mass panic, economic collapse and potentially interspecies conflict?" Before anyone could respond, the temperature in the chamber suddenly spiked. The crystalline structures began pulsing more rapidly, and a low harmonic tone filled the air, felt as much as heard. The soldiers looked nervous, some backing toward the tunnel. From the far side of the chamber, where deep shadows had hidden additional passages, figures emerged. 3 of them, tall and thin like the one in the video, wearing similar robes. But as they approached, they lowered their hoods. Lucas heard Eric's camera hit the ground. They weren't reptilian, exactly, but they weren't human either. Their features were elongated, their skin with a subtle, scaled texture that seemed to shift between colours. Their eyes were large, multifaceted, like an insect's, but with an unmistakably intelligent gaze. The lead being spoke, its voice filling the chamber without seeming to come from its mouth. "Enough!" Everyone froze. Even the suited man seemed taken aback. 50 years of negotiations, 50 years of delays, and still you point weapons in our sacred spaces. The being turned to Lucas and Eric. And you, driven by curiosity, stumble into matters beyond your comprehension. "We just want the truth," Lucas managed. "The truth?" The being made a sound that might have been laughter. "The truth is that we've shared this planet since before your ancestors learned to walk upright. We survived the extinction that killed the dinosaurs by retreating underground. We've watched your species evolve, watched you conquer the surface world. We've hidden not from fear but from wisdom. Your species has never reacted well to difference." The suited man stepped forward. "The protocols." "Your protocols have failed," the being interrupted. "The mining grows deeper, your weapons more destructive. We can no longer retreat, so we offer a new arrangement." The being gestured, and images appeared in the air, holographic projections showing underground cities of impossible beauty, technologies that defied current human understanding, and populations of beings living in sophisticated societies. "We will reveal ourselves gradually. Selected scientists, leaders, thinkers will learn of us first. Over a generation, maybe two, humanity will come to accept that you're not alone. In exchange, certain areas will be protected from mining, from development. Our cities will remain ours." "And if humanity refuses?" the suited man asked. "Then we reveal ourselves anyway, but without preparation, without context. Imagine the chaos when mining operations worldwide begin breaking through into our territories. Better to control the revelation than let it explode randomly." The being turned back to Lucas. "Your role in this is crucial. You will tell a story, not the whole truth, but enough. You'll speak of government cover-ups, of archaeological discoveries suggesting ancient civilizations. You'll prepare minds without shocking them. In essence, you'll make us mythology before we become reality. And if I refuse, then someone else will be chosen. But you've proven yourself capable, curious but not reckless, skeptical but not closed-minded. Old Kinberg chose well when he left you his research. You knew Ole? We knew of him. He was too early, too direct. The world wasn't ready. But now, with your technology advancing, your society's more connected. Perhaps the time has come." The suited man looked defeated. "This isn't my decision to make. I'll need to contact my superiors." "You have 1 year," the being said. "After that, we begin revealing ourselves with or without your cooperation." Act 5. The Silencing. The journey back to the surface felt surreal. The soldiers escorted them in silence, the suited man speaking rapidly into a satellite phone in Swedish, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. At the tunnel entrance, their equipment was confiscated, though Lucas had expected this and had already uploaded the crucial files to his cloud servers during their exploration. "You understand," the suited man said as they stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside the shaft, "that everything you've witnessed is classified, beyond any level you've previously encountered. The agreements you're about to sign aren't just about national security, they're about species security." Over the next 3 days, Lucas and Eric were debriefed by teams of officials from agencies they hadn't known existed. They signed documents in Swedish, English, and surprisingly, Russian and Mandarin. The implications were clear, this wasn't just Sweden's secret. But on the third night, a different visitor came to Lucas's hotel room. Elle entered without knocking, once again moving with that too fluid grace that betrayed her nature. "They're going to bury this," she said simply. "The governments will debate, form committees, study the implications. Meanwhile, the mining continues, the encounters increase, and fear builds on both sides." The being in the chamber said I had a role to play. That being was an optimist. I'm a realist. Your governments will never voluntarily reveal our existence, so we need another approach. She handed him a flash drive. "Everything's here. Video from encounters dating back to 1947, government documents from 12 nations, and most importantly, communication recordings between our representatives and your leaders. Not enough to cause panic, but enough to make people question." Why not release it all then? Because chaos serves no one. We need gradual acclimation, not shock. Publish what you can verify independently. Frame it as you suggested: government conspiracy, hidden archaeology. Let people draw their own conclusions. And you? What's your real role in this? Elle smiled, her features momentarily shifting to something not quite human before snapping back. I'm what you might call a cultural ambassador. I've lived among humans for 40 years, learning your ways, your fears, your potential. There are dozens like me, integrated into your societies, waiting for the day we can drop our disguises. She moved to the window, looking out at the lights of Kiruna. Your species stands at a crossroads. In the next decade, you'll either accept that you share this planet, or you'll force a confrontation that nobody wins. The choice is yours. After she left, Lucas made his decision. He returned to Stockholm with a story, but not the one anyone expected. His article, published simultaneously in 3 international outlets, focused on verifiable facts. The massive budget allocations for geological research, the sealed tunnels and military presence around Kiruna, the testimonies of witnesses who'd seen unexplained chambers and artifacts. He included the thermal imaging showing active heat management in supposedly empty caverns. He made no claims about reptilian beings or underground civilizations. Instead, he posed questions. What required such extreme secrecy? Why were archaeological discoveries being classified at the highest levels? What were governments afraid citizens might learn? The response was immediate and predictable. Swedish authorities dismissed the article as conspiracy theory, though they notably didn't deny the specific budget items or military operations he documented. His press credentials were revoked, his freelance contracts cancelled. But online, the story took on a life of its own. Other journalists began investigating similar sites in their own countries. Former military personnel came forward with corroborating stories. Scientists pointed out geological anomalies that couldn't be easily explained. Within 6 months, the pressure for disclosure was building. Parliamentary inquiries were launched. Freedom of information requests flooded government agencies. And in the background, more accidents occurred. Mining operations breaking through into chambers that shouldn't exist. Military teams photographed at sites they claimed weren't restricted. 1 year after his encounter in the chamber, Lucas received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a clear, undeniable image of one of the beings, standing in what was obviously a modern government facility, shaking hands with someone whose face was obscured but whose uniform was clearly military. Attached was a note in elegant handwriting: Phase 1 complete. Prepare for Phase 2. Lucas sat in his new apartment he'd been forced to move after too many random break-ins at his old place, staring at the cylindrical artifact Elle had given him. It had begun to change recently, the symbols glowing faintly at night, rearranging themselves into patterns that almost made sense. Eric visited regularly, both of them changed by what they'd witnessed. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Eric asked one evening. "Keeping the full truth hidden?" Lucas turned the cylinder in his hands, watching the symbols shift. Sometimes the greatest truths need to be approached sideways. If we'd published everything the videos, the direct contact we'd have been dismissed as lunatics. But by focusing on what could be verified, we've planted seeds of doubt. People are beginning to ask the right questions. And when they're ready for answers... Lucas gestured to his laptop where encrypted files waited the full videos from the chamber, the complete transcripts of interspecies negotiations, clear photographs of the beings themselves. Then we moved to Phase 2, but not yet. Humanity needs time to adjust to the idea that we're not alone before we confront the reality of who we're sharing the planet with. His phone buzzed. Another unknown number, but the message was in that strange harmonic text he'd learned to recognise as non-human communication, translated through digital systems. The Deep Council has voted. Gradual revelation approved. Your species has 5 years to prepare. Use them wisely. Lucas looked out his window at Stockholm's skyline, imagining the vast chambers and ancient cities that lay beneath. Somewhere down there, another civilization waited, watched, and hoped that humanity would prove worthy of the truth. The story old Kinberg had died trying to tell would finally be told not as a shocking revelation, but as a gradual awakening. The world would learn that myths sometimes have foundations in reality, that governments sometimes hide truths too large for immediate comprehension, and that humanity's position as Earth's sole intelligent species was nothing more than a comfortable illusion. In his desk drawer beside the cylinder lay one last piece of evidence, a photograph Lucas had taken in the chamber, but never shared. It showed a section of wall covered in symbols, but among them was something remarkable. Cave paintings, clearly prehistoric, showing human figures standing beside tall, thin beings with large eyes. Even tens of thousands of years ago, someone had tried to record the truth of humanity's neighbours. Perhaps this time, Lucas thought, the world would be ready to listen. Epilogue. 5 years later, the headlines were subtle but significant. Major archaeological discovery suggests pre-human intelligence. The article, carefully crafted by a consortium of scientists and journalists, described the recent discovery of artificial chambers beneath northern Europe, their builders unknown but clearly intelligent. Lucas, now writing under a pseudonym, contributed to the coverage. He noticed how carefully the narrative was being managed, each revelation slightly more extraordinary than the last, but never so shocking as to cause panic. The beings were keeping their promise, revealing themselves gradually, letting humanity adjust to each new impossibility before introducing the next. In Kiruna, the mine had ceased operations in certain sectors, officially due to geological instability. Unofficially, new treaties had been signed, borders established between the world above and the world below. And late at night, when Stockholm slept, Lucas would sometimes see them figures too tall, moving too fluidly, visible only to those who knew what to look for. They walked among humans more openly now, though still disguised, preparing for the day when they wouldn't need to hide. The cylinder L had given him now displayed readable text, a history of Earth that predated humanity by eons, a story of survival and adaptation, of civilizations rising and falling long before the first human drew breath. One passage haunted him. We do not fear your weapons or your anger. We fear your inability to accept that you're not special, not chosen, not alone. We fear that in learning of us you will lose yourselves. But as Lucas watched humanity slowly, cautiously, begin to accept the impossible, he felt hope. Perhaps his species was more adaptable than the beings below believed. Perhaps this revelation wouldn't break humanity but transform it. The truth was emerging from the depths of Kiruna, not as an eruption, but as a slow dawn. And humanity, step by careful step, was learning to see by its light. In the end, old Kinberg had been both right and wrong. The truth did need to be told, but it needed to be told carefully, patiently, with respect for both the tellers and the listeners. As Lucas closed his laptop and prepared for bed, his phone displayed one final message. Thank you for teaching us that truth, like evolution, happens gradually. Outside, Stockholm slumbered on, unaware that beneath its streets another city stirred. The two worlds, separate for so long, were slowly, inevitably converging. The age of hiding was ending. The age of coexistence was about to begin. The glow of 17 monitors bathed Elias Corrin's face in an ethereal blue light as his fingers danced across 3 keyboards simultaneously. In the depths of his converted basement apartment, time moved differently. Days blurred into nights, and nights stretched endlessly as he navigated the labyrinthine pathways of the dark web like a digital archaeologist, uncovering humanity's buried secrets. At 32, Elias had already earned and lost 2 fortunes through his hacking prowess. First fortune came easily, a teenage prodigy exploiting security vulnerabilities for corporate clients who paid millions to keep their weaknesses secret. He'd lived like a digital king, penthouses overlooking Silicon Valley, exotic cars that remained untouched in climate-controlled garages, while he preferred the glow of his monitors to sunlight. That first fortune vanished when he exposed Meridian Pharmaceuticals' cover-up of deadly side effects in their breakthrough arthritis medication. The leaked documents showed they'd known their drug caused cardiac episodes in 12% of patients over 60, but had buried the studies to protect their $10 billion investment. Elias had expected whistleblower protection. Instead, he found himself blacklisted from every major tech company, his reputation destroyed by a coordinated character assassination campaign that painted him as an unstable idealist who couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. The second fortune came from smaller clients, criminal organisations, corporate espionage rings, government contractors who needed deniability. The work paid well but corroded his soul, each job pulling him deeper into the shadows of the digital underworld. That money disappeared into legal fees after a wrongful arrest for hacking the Federal Reserve, a crime he hadn't committed but couldn't prove he hadn't, given his reputation and the circumstantial evidence that seemed perfectly crafted to implicate him. 2 years in minimum security prison had shown him the true cost of challenging powerful systems. The other inmates respected his technical skills, but the guards treated him like a dangerous terrorist. Solitary confinement stretched for months whenever he complained about conditions or tried to organise better treatment for his fellow prisoners. By the time he was released on a technicality, evidence had mysteriously gone missing. He'd learned that the system didn't just punish dissent, it transformed dissidents into cautionary tales. Now, money meant nothing to him, only truth mattered. His obsession with secret societies began innocently enough, a childhood fascination sparked by his grandfather's stories about World War II intelligence operations. The old man had worked as a codebreaker for the OSS, predecessor to the CIA, and had filled young Elias's imagination with tales of hidden messages and shadow wars. After his grandfather's death when Elias was 12, he'd found boxes of declassified documents in the attic, revealing just how much of recent history had been shaped by invisible hands. That childhood fascination evolved into a methodical hunt for evidence as he grew older and acquired the technical skills to dig deeper than amateur conspiracy theorists ever could. While other hackers chased Bitcoin fortunes and corporate espionage contracts, Elias pursued shadows and whispers, digital phantoms that most people dismissed as paranoid delusions. He'd spent years infiltrating closed forums where former intelligence operatives shared war stories, decrypting abandoned hard drives from defunct government contractors, and following digital breadcrumbs through the dark web's most obscure corners. His apartment had become a digital monastery dedicated to the pursuit of hidden truth, every surface covered with the tools and detritus of obsessive investigation. The apartment reflected his singular focus. Pizza boxes stacked like ancient monuments between towers of computer equipment, energy drink cans forming metallic armies across every surface, and cables snaking through the darkness like digital veins feeding his electronic ecosystem. His only companions were the hum of cooling fans working overtime to prevent his overclocked processors from melting down, and the occasional, satisfied grunt when another firewall fell to his expertise. The basement location was perfect for his needs, thick concrete walls that muffled sound and blocked electromagnetic interference, a dedicated power line that could handle his massive electrical requirements, and most importantly, no windows for curious neighbours to peer through. He'd been living there for 18 months, ever since his release from prison, paying cash to a landlord who asked no questions as long as the rent arrived on time. His setup was a temple to digital paranoia. 17 monitors arranged in a semicircle around his custom-built chair, each screen dedicated to different aspects of his ongoing investigations. 3 keyboards allowed him to manage multiple intrusion attempts simultaneously, while a collection of smartphones, each running different operating systems and connected to various networks through proxy chains, kept him connected to his sources around the globe. The walls were lined with hard drives, each containing terabytes of encrypted data collected from years of systematic investigation. Backup systems ensured that even if authorities raided the apartment, copies of everything would remain safely hidden in data centers across 3 continents. He'd learned from his previous arrests that physical evidence was only as secure as your ability to keep it out of enemy hands. Tonight felt different. As rain drummed against the boarded windows, he'd covered them himself for security reasons. Elias's automated scanners detected something unusual. The software he'd written monitored thousands of government servers simultaneously, looking for anomalous data signatures that might indicate classified information stored in supposedly routine systems. Most alerts were false positives, but after years of refinement, his algorithms had learned to distinguish between genuine anomalies and random digital noise. This particular signal was trying too hard to look ordinary, which was exactly what made it suspicious. A government proxy server deep within the Department of Homeland Security's network infrastructure was handling traffic patterns that didn't match any known legitimate use. The data packets were the right size and frequency to appear routine, but they carried encryption signatures that suggested military-grade security protecting something far more sensitive than typical administrative communications. Most hackers would have dismissed it as a honeypot, a trap designed to lure in digital intruders, but Elias had learned to read between the digital lines over years of careful observation. This signal felt different, older, like it had been running for decades without anyone paying attention to what it was actually protecting. He leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles with the deliberate ritual of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The proxy was 3 layers deep in government infrastructure, protected by military-grade encryption that would take months to crack through conventional means. But Elias had developed unconventional means over the years. His fingers resumed their dance, this time with the measured precision of a master pianist performing a familiar concerto. Code flowed across his screens like poetry written in ones and zeros, each line bringing him closer to whatever lay hidden in the digital vault. As the final encryption layer crumbled at 3:47 a.m, Elias held his breath. The archive that materialized before him contained terabytes of data, but it was the file structure that made his pulse quicken. Everything was organized with the kind of meticulous care reserved for the most sensitive operations. Categorical folders with cryptic names like cultural implementation, behavioral modification, and asset management. He opened the first file and the world as he understood it began to unravel. The contracts appeared first, hundreds of them, stretching back decades like a paper trail through the shadow history of American culture. Entertainment companies, advertising agencies, record labels, movie studios, television networks, and news corporations all bound by identical non-disclosure agreements that ran to thousands of pages each. The legal language was deliberately obscure, buried in terminology that would confuse even experienced corporate lawyers who specialized in media contracts. But Elias had taught himself to decode legal doublespeak during his prison sentence, spending countless hours in the law library learning how power structures protected themselves through linguistic camouflage. Each contract referenced cultural programming initiatives and synchronized messaging protocols, with payment structures that dwarfed typical entertainment industry deals. Millions of dollars flowing to seemingly random projects, indie films that barely recouped production costs, music albums that never charted, advertising campaigns for products that didn't seem to exist. All payments were approved by a shell company called Apex Cultural Dynamics, whose corporate registration traced through a labyrinthine network of offshore entities. Elias followed the money trail through banks in Switzerland, shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, trust funds in Luxembourg, and holding companies in jurisdictions he'd never heard of. Every lead ultimately vanished into legal structures so complex they seemed designed more for obfuscation than profit. The internal memos were more revealing, written in the casual tone of executives who felt completely secure in their communications. Corporate leaders from supposedly competing companies discussed narrative adjustments and public sentiment cultivation, like weather forecasters predicting next week's conditions. One memo from a major news network's CEO, dated just 6 months ago, read, "Per our discussion with ACD representatives, the upcoming election cycle requires a 15% increase in anxiety-inducing content during primetime hours. Latest psychological impact studies suggest optimal effectiveness when paired with consumer advertising for comfort products and security solutions." Another memo from a streaming entertainment company outlined specific quotas. Q3 targets include 40% increase in dystopian future programming, 25% increase in surveillance state normalization themes, an introduction of transhumanist concepts through minimum of 12 original series. Demographic targeting should focus on the 18 to 34 age range for maximum long-term conditioning effectiveness. The coordination between supposedly independent media companies was breathtaking in scope. Competing networks shared detailed viewer psychological profiles, coordinated their news coverage to maximize specific emotional responses, and even synchronized their entertainment programming to reinforce particular worldviews. The memos discussed marketing research into subliminal messaging techniques, optimal timing for narrative reinforcement, and methods for making propaganda indistinguishable from organic cultural trends. Video stills scattered throughout the files showed meetings in nondescript conference rooms. Faces were often obscured, but the visible details painted a chilling picture. Executives from competing companies sitting side by side, reviewing presentations with titles like Mass Behavioral Prediction Models and Subliminal Integration Techniques. But it was the symbols that made Elias's blood run cold. They appeared everywhere, in corporate logos embedded in document headers, even watermarked into video files. The all-seeing eye perched atop pyramids, numerical sequences that corresponded to occult traditions, and geometric patterns that seemed random until viewed through the lens of esoteric knowledge. As dawn broke unnoticed outside his boarded windows, Elias began constructing his theory. The Illuminati weren't just folklore, they were real, organised, and operating in plain sight. Rather than ruling through force or political manipulation, they had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Cultural engineers who shaped reality through the careful manipulation of information and entertainment. The fragments suggested a coordinated effort spanning decades. Movies that promoted specific worldviews, music that carried subliminal messages, news coverage that guided public opinion toward predetermined conclusions. Every major cultural event seemed to serve a purpose beyond mere profit or entertainment. Elias created a new encrypted partition on his most secure drive and began organising the evidence. Each piece of the puzzle revealed new connections, new layers of coordination that defied conventional understanding of how media and culture operated. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying, but this was just the first door. As he prepared to dive deeper into the archive, a notification appeared on his screen. New files were uploading automatically to the server, added in real time from sources around the globe. The conspiracy wasn't just historical, it was happening now, every day, with machine-like precision. Elias smiled grimly and opened another energy drink. He had work to do. 3 days of continuous analysis revealed patterns so pervasive they defied coincidence. Elias's custom data mining algorithms had processed thousands of hours of Super Bowl halftime shows, major film releases, top-charting music, and primetime television programming, cross-referencing them with the archived documents he'd discovered. His software compared visual elements, audio frequencies, narrative structures, and symbolic content with mathematical precision that human observation alone could never achieve. The results were undeniable and terrifying. Every major halftime show since 2005 contained specific visual elements that served purposes beyond entertainment. Choreographed movements formed geometric patterns when viewed from aerial cameras, patterns that matched sacred geometry principles known to influence human consciousness. lighting sequences pulsed at precisely calibrated frequencies, 10 Hz to induce alpha brain states associated with relaxation and suggestibility, 40 Hz bursts to trigger gamma waves linked to heightened emotional responses, and infrasound frequencies below human hearing that created subliminal anxiety responses. The costume designs weren't random fashion choices. They incorporated symbols from the archived files with mathematical precision. Ancient Egyptian imagery, Masonic symbols, occult numerology, but presented in ways that bypassed conscious recognition. The performers themselves were likely unaware of the deeper significance, but the production companies certainly understood every detail. Internal emails discussed symbolic integration quotas and archetypal reinforcement targets with the clinical precision of pharmaceutical dosing guidelines. Hollywood's role was even more sophisticated, operating as a vast conditioning apparatus disguised as entertainment. Elias discovered that blockbuster films weren't just profitable products. They were psychological programming exercises designed to shift public consciousness over decades. Action movies systematically normalized surveillance states, extrajudicial violence, and the acceptability of authoritarian responses to perceived threats. Romantic comedies promoted specific relationship models that prioritize consumption, instant gratification, and emotional instability over lasting partnership and family formation. Science fiction films served as perhaps the most insidious tool of all. They introduced technological and social concepts years before their real-world implementation, ensuring public acceptance when they finally emerged. Movies about neural implants preceded actual brain-computer interface development by exactly the time needed for audience conditioning. Films depicting cashless societies appeared precisely when digital currency infrastructure was being developed. Dystopian scenarios were presented as cautionary tales, while simultaneously making the depicted futures seem inevitable and acceptable. The music industry operated as the most direct delivery system for repetitive psychological messaging. Elias's analysis revealed that hit songs across all genres shared common structural elements designed to trigger specific neurological responses. Repetitive hooks created obsessive thought patterns, bass frequencies induced physical arousal responses, and lyrical themes consistently promoted materialism, emotional chaos, instant gratification, and distrust of traditional social bonds. Chart success wasn't organic. It was engineered through coordinated promotion campaigns that used psychological manipulation techniques, refined through decades of marketing research. Record companies employed neuroscience consultants who designed songs to be literally addictive, triggering dopamine responses that created compulsive listening behaviours. The most successful artists weren't necessarily the most talented. They were the most effective delivery vehicles for predetermined psychological content. But the most chilling discovery came when Elias cross-referenced celebrity deaths with financial markets and policy implementations, using algorithms that could detect correlations across vast datasets that human analysis would miss. The patterns were subtle but statistically undeniable. Whenever a particularly influential public figure died under questionable circumstances, the news cycle would shift dramatically within hours. Public attention would focus intensely on mourning and memorial coverage, while significant legislation passed through Congress, with minimal scrutiny or public debate. Michael Jackson's death had coincided with the most controversial aspects of healthcare reform debates, providing a massive distraction precisely when public opposition was reaching critical mass. Whitney Houston's demise dominated headlines during crucial banking regulation discussions that would have reshaped Wall Street oversight. Prince's passing created a week-long media obsession that completely buried coverage of surveillance law expansions that civil liberties groups had been fighting for months. Each event generated exactly the right emotional state to facilitate predetermined political outcomes. The deaths created collective grief that made the public more passive and receptive to authority, while the intensive media coverage consumed the attention bandwidth that might otherwise have focused on policy changes. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was orchestrated with mathematical precision. Elias found evidence suggesting that some celebrity deaths might have been actively induced rather than simply exploited. Medical records showed unusual patterns of prescription drug interactions. Security camera footage from crucial moments was consistently corrupted or missing, and autopsy results often contained anomalies that suggested external intervention. The pattern was consistent across dozens of cases spanning 3 decades. But even more disturbing was the systematic cultivation of celebrity instability. Internal documents from talent agencies and record companies outlined deliberate strategies for creating psychological dependence, drug addiction, and emotional instability in their most valuable assets. The goal wasn't profit maximization, it was creating performers who could be easily manipulated and, when necessary, destroyed at moments that served larger political purposes. The conspiracy had weaponized celebrity worship itself, turning the public's emotional investment in famous figures into a tool for mass psychological manipulation. Every death became a ritual that renewed the collective trauma bonding between citizens and their media-created gods, making the population more dependent on external authority figures and less capable of independent critical thinking. Elias created a digital conspiracy board on his largest monitor, a sprawling network of connections that would have impressed investigative agencies worldwide if they hadn't been complicit in the system he was mapping. Red lines linked entertainment companies to intelligence agencies through shared personnel, financial investments, and operational coordination. Blue lines traced money flows through the labyrinthine network of shell corporations, revealing how massive sums moved between seemingly unrelated organizations. Green lines mapped the precise timing of cultural events to policy implementations, showing correlation patterns that achieved statistical significance far beyond chance. The board revealed the Illuminati's true genius. They had weaponized human attention itself, transforming consciousness into a battlefield where wars were fought through carefully orchestrated information campaigns. In an age of information overload, controlling what people focused on had become more valuable than controlling what they thought. Distraction had evolved into the ultimate form of mind control, more effective than physical force because victims participated willingly in their own manipulation. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying. Every major cultural trend of the past 30 years could be traced back to deliberate manipulation, orchestrated through the entertainment media complex. Fashion cycles that promoted specific body images and consumption behaviours. Social media trends that encouraged narcissistic self-documentation and reduced attention spans. Political movements that channeled genuine grievances into harmless symbolic protests that changed nothing. Even conspiracy theories themselves appeared to be guided phenomena, designed to discredit legitimate questioning by associating it with obviously false claims. As Elias studied his creation through bloodshot eyes that hadn't seen natural light in days, a pattern emerged that made him question everything he thought he knew about free will and human autonomy. The manipulation wasn't just cultural, it was neurological. The constant stream of engineered content was literally rewiring human brains on a species level, creating generations of people whose thoughts and desires had been shaped by external forces since birth. The evidence suggested that the traditional concept of individual choice had become largely illusory. In a world where every piece of information was filtered through manipulated channels, where every cultural touchstone carried hidden programming, where every social trend was artificially generated, what did it mean to make an independent decision? The conspiracy had achieved something more insidious than totalitarianism. They had created voluntary slavery disguised as freedom of choice. As Elias studied his creation, a pattern emerged that made him question everything he thought he knew about free will. Every major cultural trend of the past 30 years could be traced back to deliberate manipulation. Fashion cycles, social media behaviours, political movements, even conspiracy theories, all potentially guided by the same hidden hand. The realization struck him like a physical blow. If they could control culture so completely, how could he be certain his own obsession with finding them wasn't part of their plan? The media conglomerate's server proved surprisingly easy to penetrate, which should have been Elias's first warning. Titan Communications owned 17 major news networks, 43 radio stations, controlling interests in 12 social media platforms, and content distribution deals with virtually every major streaming service. Their annual revenue exceeded the GDP of most small nations, and their influence over global information flow was effectively unparalleled in human history. Their security should have been impenetrable. Military contractors protected their networks. They employed former NSA specialists as cybersecurity consultants, and their server farms were housed in facilities that rivaled government installations. Yet Elias's intrusion tools sliced through their defences like a hot knife through butter, encountering minimal resistance and no countermeasures. It was almost as if they wanted him inside their systems. The internal documents were even more damning than the government archive, revealing coordination that made wartime propaganda efforts look amateur by comparison. Daily emails outlined narrative priorities for each news cycle, complete with psychological impact assessments, demographic targeting strategies, and measurable public sentiment targets. The language was coldly clinical, reducing human emotion and belief to data points on quarterly performance spreadsheets. Editorial meetings were recorded and transcribed with military precision. News directors from supposedly competing networks participated in weekly coordination calls, where they discussed upcoming stories, agreed on messaging frameworks, and divided coverage responsibilities to ensure comprehensive narrative saturation. The goal wasn't profit, it was behavioural modification on a civilizational scale. One particularly chilling document was titled MK Ultra Evolution, Modern Behavioural Modification Through Repetitive Exposure. It outlined techniques that made the CIA's infamous mind control experiments look primitive and inefficient by comparison. Rather than targeting individuals through drugs and trauma, the new methods focused on mass psychological conditioning through carefully orchestrated media campaigns that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The manual explained in disturbing detail how repetitive exposure to specific imagery, sound frequencies, narrative structures, and emotional triggers could alter brain chemistry over extended periods. Citizens weren't being brainwashed in the traditional sense. They were being neurologically rewired through their daily media consumption, with changes that accumulated gradually over years and decades. The process was so subtle and pervasive that victims never realized their thoughts weren't entirely their own. Predictive programming emerged as a central technique in their arsenal. By introducing concepts, technologies, and social changes through fictional entertainment, before implementing them in reality, the manipulators could bypass critical thinking entirely. Audiences would unconsciously accept new surveillance technologies, social norms, and political systems because they had been psychologically prepared through years of entertainment conditioning that made the changes feel familiar and inevitable. The technique was devastatingly effective because it exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology. People naturally accepted ideas they had encountered multiple times, even if the initial exposure came through obviously fictional sources. The brain treated repeated fictional scenarios as potential realities, creating neural pathways that made actual implementation feel like a natural progression rather than a radical change. The financial section revealed the true scope of the operation. Trillions of dollars flowed through the network annually, dwarfing the budgets of most nations. The money came from unexpected sources: pension funds, insurance companies, even charitable foundations unknowingly contributed to the conspiracy through complex investment structures. But the most disturbing discovery was the coordination between intelligence agencies, banking institutions, entertainment corporations, and technology companies, operating as a unified organism despite their apparent competition and conflicting interests. Weekly video conferences brought together representatives from the CIA, Federal Reserve, major studios, social media platforms, and multinational technology corporations. They discussed sentiment management and narrative synchronization with the casual professionalism of corporate executives planning quarterly sales targets. The recordings revealed a shadow government that operated through corporate proxies rather than official political channels. Traditional governmental power had been largely superseded by a network of private organizations that could implement policy through market manipulation and cultural conditioning without the messy inconvenience of democratic oversight. Elections still occurred, but they had become elaborate theatre productions designed to maintain the illusion of popular sovereignty, while real decisions were made in boardrooms that the public never saw. News cycles weren't random or market-driven. They were orchestrated months in advance by committees that included intelligence operatives, banking executives, media moguls, and technology leaders. Wars provided distraction from economic manipulation, while generating massive profits for defence contractors. Celebrity scandals offered convenient cover for political corruption investigations. Natural disasters created opportunities to implement emergency powers that somehow always became permanent fixtures of the expanded surveillance state. Every major event served multiple purposes in a grand design that stretched across decades. The 2008 financial crisis had been engineered to consolidate banking power while conditioning the public to accept bailouts as normal economic policy. The COVID-19 pandemic had accelerated digital transformation initiatives while normalising remote monitoring and social isolation. Climate change narratives were being used to justify energy sector reorganisation and carbon credit markets that would generate enormous profits for the same financial institutions that had caused previous economic crises. Elias found recorded conversations between news anchors and their handlers that destroyed any remaining illusion about journalistic integrity. Popular television personalities who projected authority and trustworthiness were revealed as knowing participants in psychological manipulation campaigns, carefully crafting emotional triggers with the precision of weapons designers. They discussed techniques for inducing specific brain states in viewers, optimal timing for fear-based messaging, and methods for making propaganda indistinguishable from legitimate news reporting. The most chilling recordings involve discussions of population control strategies disguised as public health initiatives. Representatives from pharmaceutical companies, government health agencies, and media corporations coordinated messaging campaigns designed to promote dependency on medical interventions while discouraging natural immunity and traditional healing practices. The goal wasn't public health. It was creating a population that required constant pharmaceutical management to function normally. Mental health treatment had been weaponized through carefully designed chemical interventions that didn't cure underlying problems but created permanent pharmaceutical dependencies. Educational systems were being restructured to produce workers who could follow complex instructions but lacked the critical thinking skills to question authority. Even exercise and nutrition guidelines were manipulated to ensure that optimal physical and mental health remained just out of reach for the general population. The evidence was overwhelming, but as Elias prepared to copy the files to his secure drives, an error message appeared. Access denied. User privileges revoked. The server was locking him out in real time, which meant someone was actively monitoring his intrusion. He worked frantically to extract what data he could, but the digital walls were closing in. As the connection terminated, one final document appeared briefly on his screen. A personnel file with his photograph in the header Asset Management, Elias Corin. Status: Active Monitoring. The file vanished before he could read it completely, but the implications were clear. They knew he was coming. Desperation drove Elias deeper into the network than he had ever dared venture. Using techniques that bordered on digital necromancy, he resurrected connection pathways that should have been impossible to access. The risk was enormous. Each probe left digital fingerprints that could lead authorities directly to his door. But the glimpse of his own file had transformed his quest from curiosity to survival. The recordings he discovered in the deepest server vaults were audio files from meetings that shouldn't have existed, according to any official record. High-definition audio captured conversations between intelligence officials, Federal Reserve board members, entertainment executives, technology billionaires, pharmaceutical industry leaders, and representatives from organizations he'd never heard of, but whose influence seemed to span continents. They discussed the future of human consciousness like generals planning military campaigns against an enemy population. The meetings followed a rigid schedule. Every third Wednesday of each month, participants would gather in a location identified only as the facility to review progress on what they called the Integration Project. The audio quality suggested advanced surveillance equipment, possibly indicating that someone within their organisation was documenting everything for purposes that remained unclear. One recording from a meeting dated 6 months ago made his blood freeze in his veins. Phase 7, implementation has exceeded all projections, reported a woman's voice that analysis software identified as belonging to a major pharmaceutical company executive. Antidepressant dependency rates have reached 23% of the adult population in target demographics. Cognitive function degradation is proceeding on schedule, with marked decreases in long-term planning abilities and resistance to authority structures. Another voice, male with a distinctive southern accent. The cryptocurrency infrastructure is approaching full readiness for behavioural tracking integration. Once we achieve real-time monitoring of every financial transaction, thought control becomes mathematically precise. Every purchase will inform our psychological profiles. Every payment will be subject to conditional approval based on compliance metrics. Money itself becomes the ultimate surveillance and control mechanism. A third voice, older and carrying unmistakable authority. Excellent progress. The entertainment division reports successful integration of transhumanist themes across all major platforms. Public acceptance of neural interface technology has increased 23% since the campaign began, with particularly strong adoption rates among the 18 to 34 demographic. We're ready for beta testing in select metropolitan markets next quarter. The conversations continued for hours, revealing a surveillance state that made Orwell's 1984 look like a children's story. They weren't just watching citizens, they were psychologically profiling entire populations in real time, predicting dissent before it emerged, and neutralizing threats through targeted manipulation rather than direct confrontation. The system was so sophisticated that most people would never realize they were living under complete psychological control. The integration project appeared to be the culmination of decades of research into human behavior modification. Rather than controlling people through force or obvious propaganda, they had created a system that guided human decision-making through carefully crafted environmental pressures. Every choice citizens made was influenced by factors they never recognized as external manipulation, creating the illusion of free will while ensuring predetermined outcomes. Food additives that affected brain chemistry, architectural designs that induced specific emotional states, lighting frequencies that influence circadian rhythms, sound pollution calibrated to create chronic stress. Every aspect of modern life had been optimized to create psychological conditions that made populations easier to manage. The genius was that victims participated willingly in their own subjugation, often defending the very systems that enslaved them. The Watcher Protocol emerged as their most sophisticated tool. Rather than silencing conspiracy theorists and dissidents, they monitored them continuously, studying their methods and psychology. The dial was used to identify others with similar thinking patterns, creating detailed maps of potential resistance before it could organize effectively. But the most chilling revelation was their approach to handling discovered threats. They didn't assassinate or imprison troublesome individuals, they drove them insane. Subtle psychological pressure, engineered coincidences, and carefully orchestrated personal tragedies would destroy a person's credibility and mental stability. Victims became their own worst enemies, discrediting themselves more effectively than any external force could. Elias found case studies documenting the destruction of dozens of individuals who had gotten too close to the truth. Journalists who suffered sudden career implosions, researchers who developed inexplicable mental health problems, hackers who became paranoid and unstable. The pattern was consistent. Initial discovery, followed by escalating pressure until the subject either retreated into obscurity or self-destructed publicly. As he absorbed this information, strange coincidences began occurring in his own life. His internet connection inexplicably slowed at crucial moments. Phone calls developed electronic interference. His food delivery orders were mysteriously cancelled or delayed. Each incident was minor and easily dismissed as random bad luck, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Someone was watching. Elias tried to dismiss his growing paranoia as a natural reaction to the disturbing information he was processing. But late at night, when the city was quiet and his monitors provided the only light, he sometimes heard footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. They would pause at his door for exactly 30 seconds before continuing down the corridor. The recordings had mentioned something else, something that made his hands shake as he worked. Subject 347 shows exceptional pattern recognition abilities. Psychological profile suggests high probability of success in reaching final verification stage. Recommend maintaining current stimuli until extraction protocols can be implemented. He had no way of knowing for certain, but the timing suggested a horrible possibility. He might be Subject 347. The decision to leak his findings publicly felt like stepping off a cliff. Elias had accumulated enough evidence to expose a conspiracy that dwarfed anything in human history, but he knew that releasing it would likely cost him his life, or worse, his sanity. Yet the alternative was remaining silent while humanity sleepwalked toward a digital totalitarianism that would make physical oppression obsolete. He began by seeding information across the dark web's most secure forums, using identity masking techniques that should have made him untraceable. The posts were carefully crafted to appear as random discoveries by different users, avoiding the pattern recognition algorithms that monitored conspiracy communities. Each fragment of evidence was real but incomplete, requiring readers to connect the dots themselves. The response was immediate and disturbing. His posts gained traction quickly, too quickly. Within hours, they were being shared across platforms, analysed by citizen journalists, and discussed in mainstream media as examples of dangerous misinformation. The speed of the reaction suggested a coordinated response, as if the revelation had been anticipated and prepared for in advance. More troubling was the nature of the responses. While some users took the evidence seriously, others immediately began discrediting it with arguments that seemed too sophisticated to be spontaneous. They pointed to technical inconsistencies that Elias was certain didn't exist, questioned source authenticity with forensic expertise that suggested professional training, and redirected discussions toward harmless tangents that neutered the information's impact. Within days, his revelations were being treated as another internet conspiracy theory, filed alongside flat earth theories and lizard people claims. The evidence was dismissed not through logical refutation, but through association with obviously false ideas, a technique the archived documents had called cognitive contamination. As the online discussions evolved, Elias realised he was watching a masterpiece of psychological manipulation in real time. The truth was being buried not through censorship, but through calculated flooding with disinformation. His genuine evidence was drowning in a sea of deliberate nonsense, making it impossible for reasonable people to distinguish fact from fantasy. But the digital warfare was only the beginning. Physical reality began shifting around him in subtle but unmistakable ways. His internet speed slowed to a crawl whenever he tried to upload new evidence. Delivery services could no longer find his address. His phone developed a mysterious static that made conversations nearly impossible. Even his electricity began fluctuating at random intervals, causing his equipment to crash at the most inconvenient moments. The psychological pressure was more sophisticated than anything he had imagined from the case studies. Rather than obvious intimidation, he faced a constant series of minor inconveniences and technical failures that could be dismissed as coincidence by anyone who wasn't experiencing them directly. The effect was maddening, literally. He began questioning his own perceptions, wondering if paranoia was making him see patterns that didn't exist. Sleep became elusive as his apartment filled with unexplained sounds. Electronics hummed at frequencies that seemed designed to prevent rest. The heating system cycled erratically, creating temperature fluctuations that made comfort impossible. Water pressure dropped whenever he tried to shower, and his refrigerator developed a whine that stopped only when he was away from his computer. Friends and family members began expressing concern about his mental state, though he couldn't remember telling them about his research. They called with surprising frequency, all using similar language about the importance of seeking help and taking breaks from the computer. The conversations felt scripted, as if his loved ones were reading from prepared statements. As days blended into a haze of technical failures and social pressure, Elias realised he was living inside one of the case studies he'd discovered. They weren't just monitoring him, they were actively dismantling his life with surgical precision. But unlike the previous victims, he knew what was happening. That knowledge might be his only chance of survival. He had to reach the final layer of the archive before they completed their psychological destruction. If his theory was correct, the deepest files would contain the ultimate revelation, and possibly his salvation. The final server required every technique Elias had learned over 2 decades of hacking, protected by quantum encryption and guarded by AI systems that adapted to his intrusion attempts in real time. It represented the pinnacle of digital security. Yet as he worked through the night, fueled by desperation and the last of his energy drinks, the barriers fell with almost suspicious ease. The locked folder contained exactly what he had expected and feared: complete dossiers on hundreds of individuals, including himself. His file was massive, containing information that should have been impossible to collect. Screenshots of every computer session going back years, audio recordings from devices that shouldn't have had microphones, even biometric data tracking his health and emotional states in real time. But it was the analysis that truly horrified him. Psychological profiles predicted his behaviour with uncanny accuracy, mapping his personality down to neurological quirks that he had never shared with anyone. The files detailed his childhood trauma, relationship patterns, cognitive biases, and emotional triggers with clinical precision. They knew him better than he knew himself. The surveillance had begun long before his current investigation. Webcam captures showed him staring at monitors in his apartment, taken from angles that suggested multiple hidden cameras. Phone conversations with friends and family had been recorded and analysed for stress patterns and emotional manipulation opportunities. Even his online shopping habits, medical records, and financial transactions had been fed into behavioural prediction algorithms. Most disturbing was the timeline. The earliest entries in his file dated back 15 years, to when he had first begun investigating conspiracy theories as a college student. They hadn't just discovered his activities, they had been watching and shaping them from the beginning. Every major breakthrough in his hacking skills, every connection he had made in underground communities, every piece of evidence he'd uncovered, all had been carefully orchestrated. The documents revealed the true scope of his manipulation. The pharmaceutical company he had exposed years earlier, the leaked documents had been strategically placed for him to find. The wrongful arrest that had cost him his fortune, engineered to isolate him and fuel his paranoia. Even his current apartment had been selected for him, the basement location perfect for the psychological pressure techniques they planned to employ. But the most shattering revelation was still to come. As he scrolled through terabytes of personal data, a video file caught his attention. The timestamp showed it was recorded 3 days ago, the night he had first accessed the government server. The video showed him working at his computer, but the angle was impossible. The camera had to be inside his monitor, watching him as he discovered the conspiracy. He was staring at footage of himself reading about his own surveillance. The video continued, showing him creating his digital conspiracy board, making connections between entertainment companies and intelligence agencies, even the moment when he had first seen his own photograph in the corporate files. But there was something else, a timestamp in the corner that made no sense. According to the file properties, the video had been created 6 months before it was allegedly recorded. His hand shaking, Elias cross-referenced the timestamp with other files in his dossier. The pattern that emerged destroyed everything he thought he knew about his investigation. Every revelation, every breakthrough, every piece of evidence he had discovered, all had been prepared in advance. The conspiracy he had uncovered was real, but his discovery of it had been choreographed down to the minute. They hadn't just been watching him, they had been directing him, feeding him information at precisely calculated intervals, allowing him to feel the satisfaction of discovery, while ensuring he found only what they wanted him to find. His entire investigation was a performance, and he had been playing his role perfectly. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment was no longer mysterious. It was his cue that the final act was about to begin. The timestamp that shattered Elias's world appeared in a routine system log, buried among thousands of other entries he might have overlooked in his haste to process the overwhelming data. But his pattern recognition skills, honed by decades of digital archaeology, caught the anomaly immediately. His surveillance file had been created 3 years before he had even begun his serious investigation into secret societies. Not updated, not modified, created. The implications spread through his mind like digital wildfire. Every forum post that had sparked his interest, every breadcrumb of evidence he had followed, every contact who had guided him toward new information sources, all had been carefully planted elements in an elaborate psychological experiment. He wasn't hunting the Illuminati. He was their laboratory rat, navigating a maze they had constructed specifically for him. The files reveal the true scope of the operation. Project Cassandra aimed to study how individuals with specific psychological profiles could be guided toward predetermined conclusions while believing they were conducting independent research. Elias was test subject 347 in a series that had already processed thousands of potential dissidents, conspiracy theorists, and amateur investigators. The methodology was diabolical in its sophistication. Rather than suppressing information, they had created controlled leaks that satisfied the subject's desire for hidden truth, while ensuring that any revelations served their ultimate purposes. Every conspiracy theorist who believed they had uncovered secret plots was actually participating in a massive behavioural study that helped refine mass manipulation techniques. But Project Cassandra served another purpose, creating the perfect patsies. When subjects like Elias inevitably attempted to share their discoveries, the public would dismiss them as delusional paranoids. The conspiracy theorists discredited themselves more effectively than any government censorship could, providing cover for the real operations happening in plain sight. The genius was circular. They used genuine conspiracies to hide their conspiracy, to create conspiracy theories. The Ouroboros of manipulation consumed its own tail while strengthening the head. Elias found video recordings of planning meetings where researchers discussed his psychological profile like entomologists studying an insect. His obsessive personality, his need for validation through intellectual superiority, his isolation and distrust of mainstream society, all were noted as advantageous traits for the experiment. They had identified him as an ideal subject before he had even begun his journey into the digital underground. The recordings were clinical in their detachment. Subject 347 shows exceptional persistence and pattern recognition abilities. Recommend accelerating the revelation timeline to achieve maximum psychological impact. His technical skills allow for more sophisticated evidence plants than previous subjects. Agreed. The deep web forums are seeded and ready. Will allow him to discover the entertainment industry connections next week, followed by the financial networks the following month. Estimated timeline to complete breakdown, 6 to 8 months. What about extraction? Standard protocol. Once he achieves full paranoid state, we'll activate the final revelation. The cognitive dissonance should ensure complete psychological collapse within 72 hours. Subject will either retreat into catatonic withdrawal or self-eliminate. Either outcome serves project goals. The footsteps outside his door had stopped. In the silence that followed, Elias could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like a countdown timer. Every shadow in his peripheral vision might be a hidden observer. Every electronic device could be a surveillance tool. Even his own thoughts felt compromised, infected by the knowledge that his mind had been invaded and mapped by researchers who understood his psychology better than he did. But as despair threatened to overwhelm him completely, a final realization emerged from the chaos of his collapsing worldview. If they had created all of this as an experiment, if his investigation was a carefully orchestrated performance, then the evidence he had found might be real after all. They couldn't manipulate him with fake conspiracies. They had to use genuine ones to make the manipulation believable. The entertainment industry coordination, the financial manipulation, the psychological conditioning of entire populations, it was all real. His discovery of it might have been staged, but the conspiracy itself existed exactly as he had uncovered it. They had made one critical error in their psychological experiment. They had given him access to the truth. The question was whether that knowledge could serve any purpose now that he understood his role as an unwitting puppet. As the footsteps resumed outside his door, moving with deliberate slowness toward his apartment, Elias realized he had perhaps minutes to decide how this story would end. He could retreat into madness as they expected, becoming another cautionary tale about the dangers of conspiracy thinking. He could attempt to fight back, though they had mapped every aspect of his psychology and would anticipate any strategy he might devise. Or he could find a third option, something they hadn't planned for because it lay outside their understanding of his character. The gentle knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. A voice, polite and professional, spoke through the thin wood. "Mr. Corrin, we need to talk." Elias looked at his screens one final time, at the conspiracy board that had consumed his life, at the evidence that proved humanity was being manipulated on a scale beyond historical precedent. Then he looked at his reflection in the dark monitor, the face of a man who had discovered that his greatest fear and greatest hope were the same thing. He had found the truth. The truth had been carefully crafted to find him. But perhaps, in that circular dance of manipulation and discovery, lay an opportunity that neither he nor his watchers had anticipated. After all, even the most sophisticated psychological experiment could produce unexpected results. As he reached for the door handle, Elias Corrin smiled for the first time in months. If they had taught him anything, it was that reality was far more malleable than most people believed. And if reality could be shaped, then perhaps it was time for the subject to become the experimenter. The door opened to reveal figures in dark suits, their faces professional masks hiding whatever emotions they might have felt. But as they looked into Elias's eyes, something shifted in their expressions, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested their psychological profiles might have missed something crucial about their carefully studied subject. "Gentlemen," Elias said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind, "I've been expecting you. Shall we discuss what happens next?" The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.